this book, Mythos and Logos. We're still in Mythic Desperation, and I'm belatedly taking the opportunity to do the deep dive on Heraclitus I've been promising for weeks. And then after this, we can proceed with the rest of the text, because this is one of the keys to unlocking Kenneth Smith's meaning in the things that he writes. He has Heraclitus on the brain, and someday we may get him to finish his magnum opus series of books on Heraclitus, which he started. But in the meantime, we can at least go to Heraclitus himself, who was the big inspiration for Kenneth Smith, for Hegel, for Kierkegaard, for Marx, for Nietzsche, for Hannah Arendt. It's a lot of the modernist philosophers, especially the existential ones, take Heraclitus for granted as their worldview and framework for epistemology. So let's see if we can do a deep dive that goes beyond the cliches. Heraclitus did write his own stuff down. He wrote a scroll that he deposited at the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was one of the wonders of the world. And later observers said the scroll was very difficult to read because it was so dense and pithy, that each sentence was pregnant with so much meaning that, as Aristotle said, if you want to understand Heraclitus, you have to turn the scroll of Heraclitus very slowly and spend a lot of time thinking about how it all gets put together. And that's because Heraclitus is not a Apollonian philosopher, despite the fact that he talks about the logos relentlessly. He is a mythic philosopher. He's an archaic philosopher, more Dionysian. And as such, he's part of an older tradition that Thales and others were part of, where instead of writing great tracts or dialogues, they were attempting to write individual aphorisms that were so powerful that even just having one of them would open up whole vistas of wisdom to you. And if you could get several of them and figure out how they combine together, then it would just be mind exploding, because it'd be, it's when Nietzsche says, "It is my goal to say in 10 sentences what someone else says in a book," and then says what they don't say in a book, to go beyond what people are able to express in a book and just do it that short. They're harking back to Heraclitus. To the density of meaning, to the poetry, to the ability to evoke so much and not spell it all out, so that the job of the reader is to just memorize it and be done and be true to it, but rather that the things that they're saying are pregnant with so much meaning, and that your job as reader is now to go explore all of that and unfold it and figure out what it all applies to and how it changes your view of the world. A perfectly formed aphorism in the archaic sense could keep you busy for the rest of your life, whereas any random sentence out of a Platonic dialogue is interesting, and you might come back to it from time to time, but you need the whole dialogue to get the whole point. So it's a completely different style of writing with a different kind of philosophy at work. Most people don't have heard of gnosis and how it was written down it was inscribed on the entryway to the Oracle at Delphi, right? We all know this story, know thyself, right? What we don't know, most of us, is that it was part of a whole set of aphorisms. There was an enormous collection of aphorisms that were written down there. And that wasn't the only place they were written down. The Greeks were in this habit of erecting these stelae, these monoliths, throughout the Greek world. And on these monoliths were inscribed the same set of aphorisms from this early period of Greek philosophy. So when Alexander the Great got as far towards India as he was going to go, before he turned around and went back home, they erected a stela like these others that had the aphorisms on it. Because they're like, if we have anything to offer the world at all, what we should be offering is what is the best of the wisdom we've been able to come up with so far. The origin of that, you can Google this. You can look up this thing about the stelae and how they get erected throughout the Greek world. It's not widely known, and it should be, because it shows something about what the Greek intent was. That they were part of what they were trying to do was exchange wisdom with different cultures and to collect the wisdom that those cultures had that they didn't have. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about that. So these aphorisms, in a sense, you have to come to it not only with an open mind, but capacity to understand beyond that.
Yes.
But the question I have is, I kind of know how different that is, but I want you to explain it. How different is that in relationship to contemporary physics like E equal MC squared. That's kind of like an aphorism, right?
Yes.
You have to know a lot to unpack it. Or
Yes.
F equals MA, so in a sense, both traditions have developed these sort of intense statements that needs a lot of unfolding to understand it.
Yes. Yes. At its best, the noetic Verstand Apollonian approach to knowledge again is seeking these dense natural laws that are short and pithy and seem to apply to everything. And physics is one of the places where we see the most of that, where they've been able to. That's why they don't just call it a theory. It's why they call it a natural law, because they're so excited about its nearly universal applicability and how it seems to be valid everywhere. And when they do that, they're just trying to do in a mathematicized way what these archaic philosophers were trying to do in a qualitative way.
Mhm.
But you're right. That's exactly the parallel. That's what they were after. And so when Heraclitus wrote his scroll, he was trying deliberately to 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 contribute to that tradition of aphorisms so potent that you could inscribe them on a stela and erect them throughout the empire. That's why everybody keeps saying you can't step in the same river twice. He worked like crazy to come up with such a dense formulation of the concept of mutation and flow and transformation as a natural part of nature, as an essential part of nature that you could find anywhere in nature that you look, from the large scale of the universe into galaxies and solar systems, all the way down to individual cells into the structure of DNA, that it's all flowing. And so what we're going to see as we go through this book is that although you can, and I will, put together some of these aphorisms into sequences, he didn't. He has the longest sequence we know about is about 3 sentences. And other than that, they're either 2 sentences or 1 sentence. And that was it. That's what he would do. So, and this thing, it's worth knowing too that this wasn't just a side project of philosophers and other lovers of wisdom. Politicians back in the archaic era actually commissioned philosophers to contribute what they thought their wisest aphorisms were. And that was how the original collection at Delphi was put together, and that was then copied throughout the empire. Know thyself. We don't know for sure if it was Thales. It might have been Thales. That's one of the theories. But whoever it was one of the philosophers that the politicians knew. And they said, come in here, contribute your stuff. And they looked at the list and said, ooh, that's a good one. Let's put that at the top of the list. And that's where that all came from. It was based on the idea that all politics ought to be submitted to wisdom. If you read the history of the ancient Greek world, you'll see case after case where politicians, before embarking on a war or some other enormous thing, would themselves personally travel to Delphi and consult the oracle. And the reason that they put those aphorisms at the entryway to the oracle at Delphi is they're like, don't even bother coming in and asking the oracle for anything until you soak in some of what we've captured here on the stela, right? You're not going to understand what we're going to say until after you know thyself, after you learn nothing to excess, until after blah, blah, blah. So there's this idea also of it as kind of a filtration process for the most powerful people. If they wanted access to wisdom, they first had to go through this mesh of kind of well accepted, well understood, or ish, deep wisdom as exemplified by this list of aphorisms. So that's what he was doing. When he wrote a scroll, he was trying to say, well, here's another list of aphorisms that I really wish were on that stela. We know that because he just about says so. He references the oracle at Delphi repeatedly. And he also references know thyself repeatedly in different ways. So he's seeing what he's doing as an extension of that. And that's how we need to read it in order to.
Is this Kenneth Smith, or is this another philosopher, or a Greek philosopher he's referring to when you say he?
Heraclitus.
Heraclitus, okay, thanks.
Today's Heraclitus Day. We're gonna use Heraclitus. We're gonna walk you guys through an overview of the parts of Heraclitus that don't usually get quoted, but that Hegel and Smith and others take for granted. And that once you've seen this stuff, you'll realize it's everywhere in what Smith writes. All of Smith's writings are constantly referencing the cosmology and framework and epistemology of Heraclitus. And the same with Hegel. If you read Hegel before you've read Heraclitus, you get one thing out of it. But after you've read Heraclitus, you get something else entirely. And that's important to know because, Hegel said There wasn't a single proposition of Heraclitus's that Hegel didn't make a central part of his own philosophy. He's like, he was agreeing with Heraclitus that yes, that you will be my filter, my doorway to the oracle of wisdom, and everything that I do as a philosopher will pass through that first and be organized by that. So all right. So let's if you guys are any preliminary questions before we dive into this, before I start?
Yeah, the idea, we read Hegel's, his view of nature, because I was looking at it, and he seems to view nature as something, as an idea that is somehow, outside of, one's really, it's not part of one's rational being.
Yes.
It's something. It's an idea that that is not really part of our reason. Is that
yes? True? Yes, we're going to talk about that today. Oh, okay. That's central to Heraclitus as well. It's part of. You remember in earlier weeks we distinguished between the capital L logos and the lowercase l logos. And for Heraclitus, the capital L logos is the logic or reason or idea that is immanent in the cosmos. That when you look at the cosmos, you can see that it's organized, that it has an intelligence. And some of the quotes that we're going to get to in the next 15 minutes, he just flat out says it, that there is an intelligence that encompasses humanity, that's larger than humanity, that we're immersed in. And that when we engage in our own private intelligence, we risk distancing ourselves from the real intelligence that we're supposed to be aligning ourselves with. And so Hegel's got this same idea, that there is the truth of the ideas that make nature go, and then there is the sometimes true, sometimes false, usually in between ideas that people have about that cosmic natural idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of get the sense that Hegel was saying that the human rationality is somehow above nature, that is separate from nature, the idea of nature.
Yeah, there's a quote. I'll just quote from that comes right out of Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, "Man is not rational. Only what encompasses him is intelligent." And he says, "Human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it." Mm-hmm. And so and he'll say it even more clearly in the stuff we talk about, the schism between the ideas we have and the ideas that nature has immanent and intrinsic to it, waiting for us to discover it if we can just get out of our own heads long enough to focus on it and pay attention to it. This is a recurring motif in Heraclitus and Hegel. Phil.
Yeah, it does seem to me that there is a difference in this sense. Like, if Heraclitus says that we can never, in a way, get to the real understanding, only it's out there, there seems to be a gap that allows you to in a sense, believe that imagination is always part of it, in which case while you never get there, you always have this mystery that poetry itself allows for that mystery to be. Well, let's say in contemporary science, even though they'll say, well, the model's incomplete, they do believe that they'll get there. Like, yes. In other words, they will finally get to the destination. And whereas that, it seems to me like the ancients and the mythos kind of culture, seems to me there's always going to be that gap, and yes. You just have to kind of believe that there is that wisdom behind your wisdom. So in a sense, to be comfortable in that thing, because like it almost seems like all of those, like, what the Tao is not the Tao. I mean, it's like,
yes,
it's the thing that
yes.
You never get there, and you have to exist in this sort of state of, on the one hand, uncertainty, but to allow yourself that comfort in that zone.
Yes. Yes. The opening lines of the Tao Te Ching express that so beautifully. The the word that can be spoken is not the eternal word. The path that can be walked is not the eternal path. It's like the difference between the model in our heads and the reality that's around us is always going to be present. And the idea that the universe is so tiny and simple that with just the passage of a finite number of generations, we will have it all specced out is absurd, because it's so much bigger than we are and so much more. We have to sort of make our peace with the truth that we are modeling within a context of mystery and ignorance and half-truths. And that the best science comes out of that, in which we say, this is what we've worked out so far. We know there's more. We know there's so much more. We don't even know how much more there is. We're going to keep exploring and keep illuminating the darkness, but we're never going to confuse our model with the real thing.
You did
And
get you did get my paper, did you not?
Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to reading it today. Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you.
You know, in Hegel's philosophy of nature, the first sentence in the preliminary concept, he says, nature has presented itself as the idea in the form of otherness.
Yes.
So it's like nature is an otherness.
Yes.
It's an otherness, which somehow gives me a sense that we're not really part of nature. Somehow he's elevate rationality, above nature or outside of nature.
Yeah, he's trying to get at this problem that he's writing in a context in which there's already been Kant and Descartes. And you've got to kind of deal with, if cogito ergo sum, you have to address it. It's like if we center our identity in the things that we think, then we begin from a prospect of alienation. And as an idealist, Hegel spends a lot of time talking about the mind and our models for things. And so the very first thing he has to say is the separation between the self and the other. The other of the natural world is where the truth is. And the comfortable ideas we have that are part of the self are where the falsehood is. And so that's why he starts out with that alienation. He's trying to, there's a diagram maybe I'll do for next week. Or a couple of them. They're very simple. But if you draw a couple of people looking at the same thing and thinking their own thoughts in a little balloon, you can have a picture in the middle, which is the actual world. And then you look in their thought balloons and they have warped versions of that thing. And the two warped versions are different from each other. And the two people then argue about which of the two of them is right. But the truth is, as Heraclitus says, the human doesn't have any real understanding. The one that's right is the real world, the actual world. And that our job is to recognize that it is other from our conceptions of it. And that the pursuit of the truth is not something that you finish and then check off and say, yeah, I get to be right all the time. But it's a lifelong journey in which we're constantly embracing the truth of our ignorance alongside the truth of the models that we've got so far and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And so that's why Hegel starts right there, is he's basically responding to a whole line of philosophy that goes back through the ages that says you can start by assuming you know what's right and what's true. And he's saying, oh no, the truth is over there. We're over here. We have a long journey ahead that's never going to finish. Marianne, you've got your hand up.
So I've been trying to contemplate what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. And I thought I had a nugget where I thought, like, okay, the god Zeus comes from Mount Olympus. And in terms of the collective consciousness, we have stopped incorporating the finite and embedding it into that. And that was, like, to me, profound. And then when I was reading a little bit of Kenneth Smith, I was going back, well, the divine nature is the path forward. And as I'm listening to you about the Delphi of Oracle, I understand they're older women, and also that the vapors had them put in a trance.
Yes.
And so there was, before the rational, they spoke to the nature spirits. And I'm trying to really reimagine civilization that can we get around what we're doing. And I need help in understanding that, like, to honor the finite in us in a way frees us on some level and not honor the supernatural out there stuff. because the trees are dying on Bainbridge.
Yes, yes. From a modern Apollonian perspective, it's astonishing that a civilization would put wisdom derived from hallucinogenic trances above politics. That the most powerful politicians would go seek insights from people who were stoned on these hallucinogenic vapors. But there's actually a fair amount of evidence that in the deep prehistory of time, a lot of cultures around the world sought wisdom by breaking out of the models that they had in their head. You know, it's a huge difficulty to try to escape your own head. It's very hard because you've arranged throughout a lifetime of experience, you've arranged your own ideas and feelings so that they seem to make sense and they seem to be complete and they don't seem to need anything else. And so they sort of exclude whole sections of reality. This is what Kenneth Smith says repeatedly, that cultures are more typified not by the things that they say they're about, but by the things they exclude as unthinkable, by the lacunae, the surds, the inexpressible ideas, the blind spots. Those are what make it so that you don't immediately say, well, this culture is incomplete, I should go somewhere else. They sort of rule out alternatives and turn you inward into a little envelope. And in doing that, it makes it really hard to break out of, going back to what James was saying about Hegel, it makes it really hard to break out of your own models and turn away to look at reality. And so cultures apparently have been using hallucinogenics for sacred purposes for a very long time in order to break the hold that the mind has over you. And so the idea is that hallucinogenics now might just be used for recreation, but once upon a time they were used in a sacred facility, like shamanism throughout the Siberian cultures did this a lot, where the shamans, it wasn't that people were getting stoned all the time just because, wow, I need to pass the time and this is fun. It was like shamans would get stoned, but first they would go through initiation and study, and they'd learn as much as they possibly could. They developed their epistemology and ontology and worldviews, and then confronted with a question, they'd use hallucinogenics to crack their brain open and to look at the world a new way. And then once they were through the trance, they would try to translate it back into whatever they saw, what their insights, back into normal everyday speech so that people could understand what they'd seen. And there's a book by Graham Hancock. He's a speculative writer. He's not a philosopher and he's not rigorous, but he's a speculative journalist who really explores out of the box ideas. This book is called Supernatural. And in it, he explores a lot of the evidence that different cultures around the world used hallucinogenics in order to develop culture, in order to develop out-of-the-box insights. And it even gets into the idea that the caves at Lascaux, for example, those cave paintings were done under the influence of hallucinogenics. Some of the great breakthroughs in art might have come that way. Because if you think about it, if you're just trying to solve your day-to-day problems about how to eat and how to build a house, you don't need to travel deep into a really difficult to access cave and paint a bunch of paintings of the animals that you intend to hunt. I mean, that's not actually required. So what is it that makes people feel like they need to start doing these rituals as part of the process? And he makes some interesting arguments in there. It's all speculation, but I'll do Richard and then Phil.
I just got a couple quick comments and then a question for you, Rick. On hallucinogenics, so Thomas Metzinger, I'll type the name out in chat. He's a current modern day philosopher on philosophy of the mind. He's also consulted on like ethics of like artificial general intelligence. And I've quoted him in the chat sometimes, like, you know, saying like self is a process. Yeah, like he's given presentations on like kind of an ethical protocol on exploring new states of the mind with hallucinogenics. Just FYI, I think it was like a few years ago he made that presentation. And then when you mention kind of the two thought bubbles, kind of seeing the world and like, you know, they're not really. It kind of reminds me just of like sort of the simple but kind of, you know, fact we take for granted, or just like no two people see the same rainbow. And then you can never really get to the source of the rainbow and kind of like we'll
see what it really is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I guess like sort of the bigger thing that you kind of like we're kind of been talking about, sort of like, you know, needing to have this humility of like, you know, even as good as our knowledge gets, like that we can't lose that humility. I'm just kind of wondering out loud here. It's not really fully formed, but
yeah.
I'm wondering how sort of in the kind of in the last few centuries, like, the feud between science and religion, like Galileo, and then later the Age of Reason, Descartes, and I wonder, like how much of that dynamic has, like, I think, like, kind of like it's often kind of criticized of religion, that's like whenever there's some unknown, they substitute God, right? And then and like the churches, and like to kind of maintain their power of the institution. And then I think, like, there's some sort of Nietzschean move to kind of like kill that uncertainty, but then, like, that's that has like other kind of drawbacks. I mean, I don't think it's like, like a monolithic, like homogeneous response of, like, of course, like, like often, like, when you hear these like astrophysicists and like they're finding out these like so weird things about, like, the universe,
Yes.
and the fabric of physics and nature, it's like, like they have
Yes.
this wonder about them, right? So
Exactly.
I'm just curious about like that sort of this, this, we have this like thesis antithesis kind of like through our
Yes.
history for that.
Yes. Yeah, it's intrinsic to this thing, and you find that many of the most dedicated scientific investigators are some of the most eloquent about the role of the unknown and mystery and incompleteness in understanding our models and our approach to the world. Yes, we use the best model we have at any given time, and we need to learn what that model is, but no, we don't confuse that with the truth. The truth is outside of our head, and we're just modeling it from a distance. So you see, there was an essay written back in the 1980s by Carl Sagan where he distinguishes science 1 and science 2. And he says science 2 is this body of theories and knowledge that we've built up over the years, and most people think that is science. He says, but it's not. That's just the current models we have from science. He says science is really science 1. And science 1 is the philosophy, the natural philosophy underlying science that leads people to say it's not enough to just speculate about the world. You have to test your speculations against the world to come up with genuine models that are worthwhile. And that the whole time you're doing that, you must never confuse the resulting model, no matter how useful it is. You must never confuse the resulting model with reality. That idea of the two heads looking at the same world, thinking their own different thoughts, trying to refine their models over time, or if they confuse what their thought is with reality, not refining it and becoming dogmatic about it. It says this understanding about the relationship between the human thought and the intelligence that's built into the world. He says that's the foundation of science. That's science 1. He says, given a choice, if he had to choose to give up everything we've ever learned from science or to give up the scientific method, he says it's no choice. He'd in a heartbeat give up everything we've ever learned. Because if all you have is science 2, if all you have is the ideas, it could quickly turn into a dogmatism and you'd ossify as a civilization. But if you've got science 1 for real, you'll get back everything from science 2. You'll rediscover it, because that's the whole point of science 1. Is that it creates the dialogue between the mind and reality that makes it possible to make our models better over time. And if cultures were more committed to science 1 than they are, we would have made much faster scientific progress over the years. Every place where we got stuck was some place where somebody got attached to their ideas and didn't want to make it accountable to reality, didn't want to test it against reality. So this idea of what's in nature and what's in our head, that comes right, you're going to see in a few minutes, it comes right out of Heraclitus. Phil, then Sharon, then James.
Yeah, I mean, I believe in the mysteries, okay?
Yeah.
But I'm confounded by this, because on the one hand, it almost seems like civilization has straitjacketed us to, in a sense, wanting to, at least functionally, in the world. So we want to know something, right? And I wondered whether that was an inevitability with the development of the human mind in this sense. Like a number of years ago, I was interested in the blind spot. I actually did an experiment myself. And first I tried to find out what it was, like covering one eye and doing this, and then holding my, and I found that the blind spot was not a spot. It was like the size of a 50-cent piece.
Yes.
Okay? And it's like, and then I decided, well, let me try do some further experiments. And what I did was I was holding a newspaper in front of me, and I sort of like, cover the blind spot, and it turned out it was like newspaper type. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then I did it in color. You know, let's say it was like, let's say I had a green spot inside of a red field, and I moved it to the blind spot, and of course the green spot turned red.
Mhm.
And so like there's a desire, seems to be the mind, to want to know whether it's real or not, at least a representation of the world as it best sees it because it creates it. Then finally, what I did was I decided to like make a bunch of circles, diminishing size, and I left a spot of the diminishing circle that was where the blind spot was, and
Yes.
clearly there was a gradation of dots, right? And
Yes.
then when I tried to count, literally count how many spots there was, I got incredibly confused, right? I couldn't
Yes.
count, but the illusion was it was a continuous strip of spots. Now, and it's like, then I finally did a piece in which I had this circle in the middle where the blind spot would be, and I would have half the paper painted red and half paper painted green. I put in that blind spot, and it turned out the blind spot, which was in a sense blank, became half red and half green. And I'm saying, like, yes, the mind wants to know, if not for reality, at least in terms of appearances, what the hell is in front of it.
Yes.
And I wonder whether that itself did not stem us to create the civilization that reinforces that absolutism in terms of like what it is. Otherwise, you know, you're going around and say, well, the blind spot could be anything, you know, the mysteries. And it's like, and then there's an aspect of us that don't want the mysteries.
Yes.
Because like, let's just make it real, is what it says.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think we're trapped in that funny circle, you know?
We are.
So,
Oh,
so
God,
unless
that's
you sort of
right on the money.
realize that your mind does make believe in order
Yes.
to fill in the things so that it's functional for you in a daily
Yes.
life, then you'll never understand that there actually is a room for mystery.
That's right. That's right. And you're right. It's built right into the structure of the brain. The brain is attempting to generate outlines and planes and shapes to delineate the room around us. And it's going to, wherever there isn't enough information, make decisions for us without us ever being involved to fill in the gaps. And it does a best guess when it fills in the gaps, but it's often wrong. It's part of why, first of all, kudos to you for exploring your blind spot like that. That's a very philosophical thing to do, right? But it's part of why optical illusions are such a useful tool for reminding us that we aren't seeing things exactly as we are, and that the act of seeing is, in fact, something your brain does, not just something that happens. There's not an equation between what's in our head and what's outside of it. There's a performance and a manufacturing that goes on, and it's imperfect. And the more we can come to grips with the reality of optical illusions, the better it helps us to understand the more complex and dangerous realm of cognitive illusions, where far beyond mere perception, once your brain attempts to derive meaning and make plans and categorize, the blind spots are much bigger, the distortions are much bigger. And the problem is, if we aren't constantly taking them back to reality and checking them the way that's so easy with an optical illusion, but that's so hard with a cognitive illusion, then we're going to have huge warpages at the same time that we think we're seeing things exactly the way that they actually are. It's a challenge. And so, part of the challenge too is that it's so useful to be certain. If the tiger is actually chasing you, it would be great not to be dithering about whether tigers exist at that moment. You really should be running. It's like, but it's also dangerous because you're not always being chased by a tiger. And so you try to apply certainty to all these situations that could benefit from a greater appreciation of the mystery and uncertainty and ignorance that's there. And we get really uncomfortable on the horns of this dilemma. So should we be certain about the way that we think reality is, or should we be uncertain And the answer is, well, like all things that involve the relationship between the human mind and reality, there isn't a single answer. The answer is it depends. And if we could see from a divine perspective what the Greeks considered a divine perspective, there would be an answer, but it couldn't be stated in human terms. Because our problem is we're always in one mode at a time when we're looking at the world. Sharon, go ahead.
This all sounds very complex. And so I want to just put forth an observation that I made. What you said is what is in nature and what is in our head are two different things, and that's where the mystery is. And I think if you look at varying cultures when they practice religious rites, and the one I know is the Rastafarians, they would sit in a huge circle and smoke a whole big long ganja, which they call the chillum pipe, and when you talk to them afterwards, right, they would have tremendous insights and they would tell you what that experience was. And that's the role, I think, of hallucinogenics. And I also noticed that they would use it in performance. It gave them enhanced performance. And coming down to the even more practical terms, if you ever watch anybody get hypnotized, that's where you try to resolve the discordance between what's in nature and what's in your mind, because it's negatively impacting your functionality.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's another really good example, the Rastafarians, because they're still doing it. They're doing it openly, and they know why they're doing it, and they tell you why they're doing it, and yet still enormous numbers of Apollonian Americans go, well, I'm sure that's not it. They just like to be high. Because we can't conceive of the idea that the Apollonian mind is incomplete, that it's not enough to get right at the truth. But
it's not confined to them. Lots of cultures do it. You know, the dancing that goes on in religious rituals is a way to make connection.
Yes.
You know, to address that blind spot. And I think all cultures do it at some level. I hate to say primitive cultures, but it's a form of worship. It's exploring nature. That's what it is.
Yeah, they're what Nietzsche would call Dionysian cultures. They're recognizing that the Begriff mind has things to offer that the Verstand mind can't offer, and that you have to have ways to get out of being stuck in your Verstand mind to be able to turn to see what the Begriff mind has to offer us. And it's why in a lot of cultures, dreams aren't just brushed off as some boring thing I did while I was sleeping. They're treated as that's a place where the creative side of the mind is at work, free from the Verstand constraints of being awake. And so you should see what it might have to tell you. I mean, it might just be entertaining or creative, but it also could be profound. And you won't know unless you're constantly checking in with it to say, so what do we have this morning? What did we pick up last night? So yeah, I mean, lots of cultures over time, you're right, Sharon, have really explored this.
It's very telling that our culture today, like our drug culture, is like legal or otherwise, is very much about numbing our pain.
Yes.
I don't know if that's necessarily true, though. How about the new microdosing culture? That's all about performance enhancing and taking some of those insights into everyday life, not getting so stoned that you're non-functional, but that you could actually participate.
Right.
It's interesting. And even our own culture, Francis Crick, I mean, he found the double helix self-admittedly while tripping on LSD. So the hallucinogenic impact on our own culture is still, you know, very important, although little discussed.
It's one of the things
enhancing.
Yes. It's one of the things that strikes you the more you study early cultures from the borders of history, from the very earliest times, the more you find they each had their specific hallucinogens and entheogens that they didn't take as everyday things, but that they always took within the context of a religious supernatural rite in order to try to connect themselves to the divine, to connect themselves to nature, to break out of their Apollonian mind. And it was considered like essential to a culture in the same way that language is essential, or you know, having access to food is essential. They thought you can't even have a culture unless you have regular sacred ways to break out of the rigidity of noetic thinking. We're one of the first cultures. You know, the modernism and its predecessors are one of the first cultures in the history of the world that thought that you could live an entirely noetic life and that would be sufficient. It's anybody else would have thought that was bizarre. James, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, isn't that what Carl Jung, his idea of the collective unconscious is, those are symbols of
Yeah.
immortality and spiritualism that were, like he's saying that modern man is
Okay.
alienated from.
Yeah. Jung's right on this. Yeah.
So so those kind of hallucinogenics may help you, tap into those collective unconscious symbols, right?
Yeah.
Also, I'm surprised that he didn't. Kenneth Smith doesn't mention Heidegger that much, because Heidegger is actually saying the same thing. They're going back to Heraclitus, pre-Socrates, and going back to Heraclitus, and even using the term phusis as
Yes.
as that, where he finds the idea of being.
Yes.
Prevalent.
Yes, Heidegger knew his Greeks, no question. I've got his book on Heraclitus. I think he has 2 of them, actually. I only have 1 of them. And he was very interested in this material. He, of course, filtered it all through a Catholic kind of theology philosophy, but in complicated ways. He's quite a challenge to read, because you're constantly trying to work out the different influences that are bearing down on how he sees things the way that he does. But it's always interesting. He is never boring, I guess, is what I would say. I can part of the mystery of how did Hannah Arendt end up being so attached to Heidegger when she was persecuted by the Nazis and he was aligned with them. You could say, well, he was a really interesting guy. He was not a stereotype in any way. So he's always got something to say that's curious. So why don't I just start diving us into the text of Heraclitus, and we'll do it in little bites, because that's how he delivered it, right? Little aphorisms. And anytime you guys have questions or comments, just throw your hands up and we'll pause and we'll talk about that, and we'll see how far we get. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And what I'm going to do for today is I'm going to leave out some of the best known stuff. We're not going to talk about you can't step in the same river twice. We're not going to talk about, fire and what he thought fire was. We're not really going to talk about a lot of those things. My focus here is on 2 things. One is the way in which this model of the world of 2 minds looking at the world, and each thinking they see something different, and neither of those things being the same thing as the world. He just basically says that. It's like central to his philosophy. The problem of human understanding is at the center. And then that's the first part. And then the second part is he talks about what he thinks wisdom is. And that wisdom is the tools to overcome that problem. And we'll see what he means by that. And then the third, the punchline, which I think we'll certainly have time to get to today, is Hegel's beloved dialectic is right here in Heraclitus. He just basically lifted it right out of Heraclitus and systematized it, but it's right here, and it's written in poetic terms that are easy to overlook until you fully take on the first 2 parts of Heraclitus's worldview and epistemology. Once you see Heraclitus's worldview of an epistemology, then when you read the things where he talks about the dialectic, you can't interpret it as anything but the dialectic. It's just, if you take Heraclitus in tiny bites in isolation from within your own worldview, it's very easy to misunderstand Heraclitus. And that's why most people don't see that Hegel just picked it up right out of here. So let's dive into this. I'm using the translations from Philip Wheelwright's book on Heraclitus. That's Kenneth Smith's favorite, and it's my favorite too. I have about 2 bookshelves that consist of nothing but translations of Heraclitus, which, when you think about how little of Heraclitus we have, it's like 1 tiny little pamphlet worth of fragments is all that we have left. And we wouldn't even have that if other people hadn't constantly referred to him. It tells you kind of how many books I've got on Heraclitus. I don't have them all, but I have a lot. I have a lot of them, and I've read them. And what I can tell you is, very few people translate Heraclitus from Heraclitus's own perspective. They almost all translate from Apollonian perspectives, Platonic perspectives, Socratic perspectives, Kantian, Cartesian, anything but Heraclitean. It's rare to find someone who pretty much lets Heraclitus speak in his own voice without them trying to bend him. There's even one translator who bends "you can't step in the same river twice" so much that he tries to use it to prove that Heraclitus didn't believe in change or flow. Right? He says, but see the river, there's still a river. So the river always exists, which means that he really believed in being, just like Parmenides. It's like, sweet Jesus, how could you couldn't possibly misunderstand Heraclitus more. But if you take things in isolation, you know, you can do that, right? The Procrustean bed of the mind can do anything. So I like Wheelwright, and Smith likes Wheelwright because he lets him speak in his own voice most of the time. Wheelwright doesn't always understand exactly what Heraclitus is up to. And so when he sort of organizes the fragments into different groups, sometimes he separates into different groups things that actually belong clearly together because one of them speaks directly to the other one. And that's okay. None of us are ever going to know exactly what Heraclitus was up to. So I'm just going to put them in my own order a little bit here. And we're only going to go through a few of the fragments today. All right, here we go. We should let ourselves be guided by what is common to all. Yet although the logos is common to all, most men live as if each of them had a private intelligence of his own. I'll just start right there with that one, because that goes right back to that opening quote from Hegel that was brought up earlier in this call, where Hegel's talking about the otherness of the truth of nature as other from us. And this is what he's saying here. He's saying that there is this private intelligence that each of us develops thinking that it's sufficient. But that the problem is, because it's private, it's not common to us. It's no basis for us to have a culture or a conversation or an understanding. We think it's okay to understand things privately, but you have to, you know, what can an individual do in the world? We need each other. And so we need to be willing to work together, to have dialogue with each other, to figure out the differences in the way we see the world and how that differs from the world itself. The world has its own logos, its own intelligence, its own logic that's separate from what we think it is. But this is science one right here. This is the foundation of the scientific method. And as you'll see, he comes back to this more clearly. Questions, comments, or concerns about that opening part?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Wittgenstein's, you know, of how language, you know, is develops in the public. There's no such thing as a private language.
Right. Yeah, so he's emphasizing that here. And he comes back to it repeatedly. Now his longest, which I think is 3 full sentences, is the longest of all the fragments. Most people put this first, but I like to put it second because I think it builds better. Although this logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it. Boom, right? Not only before hearing it, but even after they've heard it for the first time. And I'm going to interject for a second, right? Because there he's talking about the difficulty of understanding. He says, even when you look right at the truth of the world, you still don't understand it. You see it as something else. You warp it into some private intelligence instead of the thing that it actually is. And that's the process that of knowing something that human beings have by default. He then says, oh yeah, there it is. Oh, I recognize that. I'm literally looking at that page right now. That is to say, although all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, a phrase we'll come back to in a moment, men seem to be quite without any experience of it. At least if they are judged in the light of such words and deeds as I am here setting forth. And this is why most people think this was either at the beginning of his scroll or very close to the beginning of the scroll. So he's basically alluding to what his project is in writing this. And then the last part of the third sentence of this fragment is, and this is where science one is built right in, my own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature. And remember that nature for the Greeks is this pregnant, powerful, cosmological, epistemological word. And to specify how it behaves. Other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. That's the end of the opening of what Wheelwright think is the opening fragment. What I think is probably the second one. And it is a bushel of epistemology and cosmology. So let me call out a few things in it just so we can see. One is, this reinforces the idea that people can look at the same thing and have a private intelligence. And it reinforces the idea that when you interact in the world, not according to the way it actually works, but according to the way you think it works, your private intelligence instead of the true natural intelligence, what happens is it's like you're sleepwalking. It's like you're not awake. He directly compares it to sleep. And in other fragments, he talks about sleepwalkers. And he's basically saying most people who think that they're conscious are actually dreaming. They're sleepwalkers going about through the world, interacting with the real world while thinking that they're interacting with the world in their head. And as a result, many of the things that we do wrong because they're based on the ethics and truths of an imaginary world we're not actually inhabiting. And this is a state of extreme existential danger, right? It causes no end of human problems. So he then talks about all things come to pass in accordance with this logos. So, and I'll call you in just a second, Richard. This kind of underscores the idea that phusis, which is the Greek word for nature, the realm of becoming, is driven by and created by and transforms according to the rules of some kind of intelligent, coherent system that he calls the logos. The logos is in when a human being has an idea, we can put it into words and tell it to each other. It's an explicit idea. But when nature has an idea, it's not something artificial that has been written down and communicated to somebody. It's built right into the structure of the cosmos and causes it to unfold the way that it does. There is an immanental meaning, an immanental intelligence that's built right into the structure of things and that creates the structure of things. So again, he's arguing here in favor of the existence of natural laws. And he's saying that those natural laws are not something that a human being knows for sure, but there's something that exists for sure in the cosmos, because that's why there is a cosmos. It creates the cosmos. It's what generates the cosmos, the logic underlying all things. I'm going to call on Richard because he's got his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, like kind of responding to like that, like a lot of people are basically, sleepwalking and dreaming, and not really like seeing the world or like actively like thinking about it. Like we know from modern neuroscience that like a lot of these kind of patterns in your mind, you do them over and over again and it reinforces and strengthens them. And like so like when you're talking to someone who's deep into that, it's like it's hard to just like have them just always like just quickly see it another way. It's like like unlearn. Like I found so I'm studying the piano right now, and like it's sometimes it's one thing to have a difficult technique to learn. It's even worse when you've learned it the wrong way and then you have to unlearn it and then learn it the correct way again.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Sharon, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, I kind of group this pragmatically into a triangle. In life, you make mistakes. You're not quite sure what you're doing, but you have to experiment, and then you get experience. And from that experience comes your judgment. And out of that judgment comes wisdom. And the caliber of a person is how well you put those steps into how well you implement those steps.
Yes.
And this is what I'm kind of hearing from all of this here.
Yes. It's right here. I mean, if you take Heraclitus at his word, if you don't just treat him as a braggart or someone just shooting from the hip or any of the things that we expect him to be, if you assume he's really, really worked on this and thought about this and that he's trying to share something with us that is deeply important, you can see how this is the foundations of science. And you can see when Aristotle and others, in the course of saying things that we think of as deeply Aristotelian, are actually alluding to this belief right here about the relationship between our minds and the world. There is one helpful thing to bring in here is a three-part distinction that the Greeks had about the nature of ideas. They distinguished between doxa, dogma, and the truth. And I put that in the chat. Doxa is opinion. It's the private intelligence. It's what you think is true. And dogma are the rules of truth and thought, the things that people tell you you have to think. So during the medieval era, dogma was huge. And it was, now we see dogmatic or dogma as kind of an insulting thing, right? To call something a dogma. But in the medieval epoch, it was considered a sacred thing and praise, because you were supposed to follow dogma. The whatever the orthodoxy was, that's what you were supposed. Orthodoxy, you were supposed to think those things, and if you didn't think those things, you were wrong. And when you study medieval philosophers, you see a lot of places where they begin with the conclusion that they're supposed to arrive at, and then they work and work and work to try to somehow bend the evidence to make it seem like that is in fact where you end up. They start at the end and work their way backwards to create a train of thought that's actually a chain of thought. And then the Greeks distinguish both of those things from the truth being what's actually in nature, that nature is the realm of truth, and that nature, therefore, epistemologically, nature is sacred because nature has the truth and we don't. That's a sacred thing. The Greeks, the whole point of the divine is the things that we wish we had that we don't have. The things that are better than us, the things that have authority over us, the things, wouldn't it be great if we could do those things too, but alas, we're mortals. And so we're stuck, imitating, approximating, longing for, striving for, but never actually arriving at. So, in this, he's constantly talking about the logos as the realm of the truth, and that its home is physis, is nature. And he's constantly distinguishing it against the way that things seem to people. Doke moi is the phrase that in Greek means it seems to me. And that's where you get dogma and doxa from, is people believe that the way that it hits them or strikes them, the way that it seems to them must be true. People will tell you, I don't like that idea. It doesn't seem right. And they don't understand that when they use that phrase, which they think is them being their most rational and most truth-seeking, from a Greek perspective, it is the least truth-seeking, because they're focusing on their private intelligence and whether something is compatible with the private intelligence. Whereas the truth of the cosmos has no interest in our private intelligence and whether we like it or not. The fact that something strikes us very badly might actually be a sign that it's true rather than a sign that it's false, depending on how askew we are in that particular idea from the way things actually are. And so there is this impulse in us to constantly be trying to judge based on our own comfort with an idea rather than on its intrinsic truth. And he's dealing with that right here in these opening fragments, the way that people are constantly turning away from the world and back to their private intelligence, and whether they're trying to use it as the metric for the truth, right? As how to decide what's real and what's not.
Was Plato the represent either doxa or dogma? That's had this idea of nature being an othering nature, and then elevating being outside of nature.
Yeah, we'll find with Plato, there are places where he criticizes doxa and dogma, and then there's places where he's just 100% noetic, and he just postulates a system of ideas and says that's true because I just said it. It's like, it's very nominalist sometimes. Because you could tell that he's a poet and who wants to be a philosopher and not an actual philosopher. He's a great poet, but he's not actually a philosopher because he doesn't challenge himself enough. And so he flows back and forth between criticizing people who come up with their own ideas, credulously or in an act of self-love. And then on the other hand, doing it himself and asserting that that's the truth. So Plato is tricky here to read. Dave and then Phil.
Rick, that idea of truthiness that you just espoused from Heraclitus, the idea of the individual truth,
yes,
that's quite interesting. I feel that fits perfectly into the narrative of post-truth, or the idea that you could have your own truth and the facts are irrelevant at that point because you've literally turned away from the outside world into your own internal world, where you can formulate the facts to be whatever you want them to be. So that, isn't that interesting how Heraclitus has been able to predict perfectly? And that's why propaganda works so well, because it speaks to that, the limbic system, the emotionality. It's made to bypass our logical side, our processing, and then to just tap into that feeling of truthiness, you know, that feels right to me, or it doesn't feel, you don't, at that point you're not involved in science 1 or science 2 at all. It's a perfectly limbic way of tapping into the lizard brain, the brain that, you know, seeks pain and pleasure, fight or flight. That's it. And so fascinating here how Heraclitus has been able to put his finger right on the pulse.
This is why Hegel and Smith and others go back to Heraclitus over and over, because he's not a comfortable read. He's shocking. It is shocking that in just these opening 2 fragments, we have already characterized why there was a coup attempt in the United States just a few days ago. It's like the turning away from the shared reality as the source of truth, turning away to one's private intelligence and preferred sources of ideas can lead to catastrophe. I mean, the worst possible things can emerge from the simple act of mistaking the reality in one's head from the actuality that's outside of our head. And you know, to underscore it, it's not even just the reality in your own head. There are many of people, this is where doxa versus dogma comes into play, who are willing to say my own ideas might be wrong, but my preacher's ideas are true, or my favorite politician or radio show host's ideas are true. And so that acts as a dogma that becomes a pattern that's repeated throughout all the people who are sort of the cultist followers of that source. But they're not recognizing that they're still not drawing the source from the actual world. They're still just drawing it from somebody else's head.
And doesn't it also underscore the need for myth then as the common truth that all of us get to decide together in a collaborative artistic process? That's where myth comes into play here. That's why Ken Smith is so fascinating.
Exactly. That's why he's going back to Heraclitus right now in this stuff on mythos and logos. So the point of myth is not to generate a bunch of falsehoods that we all agree that are emotionally powerful, but to generate the most eloquent forms of the truth in their pithiest, most memorable ways, so that even when we're lost in an argument, we can always turn the discussion back to that common shared understanding that's based as closely as possible on these difficult truths from reality that we need to not lose track of. Phil and then Joseph.
Yeah, that's really where I want to enter, is like between private truth and this sort of like cosmic and natural truth, and sort of truth that somehow civilization has evolved into due to a certain kind of functionality. And I'm thinking that's not always negative. You just have to keep that in mind. I'm thinking specifically about changing of the just intonation from a true intonation to a just intonation. I mean, the fact that the keyboard, you know, with a violin, you know, you could always bend the notes, so that in a sense that the A flat equals the B sharp, you know, like the problem with a keyboard instrument is you can't do that. So he actually has untuned the piano in order to get this thing that fits. And yet that system in itself is a positive force that lies underneath Western music. And we don't want to throw that away, even though it in a sense violates what is actually, you know, according to Pythagorean, the harmony of the cosmos. And so in some sense, like we are by our own history forced into certain structures which are, quote, false, but we benefit from that as long as we understand that that is, quote, false, but it produces a certain kind of liberation for the music to happen. Now, obviously, when you get into something like jazz in a sense contradicts that to a certain degree and finds different notes within that, okay? So that itself, because you understand the limitation, then you understand that there is other ways of dealing with tonality rather than just intonation. But we don't want to throw away Bach. We don't want to throw away Mozart. We want to throw away Beethoven. I mean, all of that is a surplus that allows you, in a sense, to create a kind of poetic, expressive feel that's important. That is not just private, but it's, in a sense, an agreed upon structure that people exist. And I think those people who understand music understands it as a false harmony.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
often think, I don't own a piano, but if I own a piano, I would say to the piano, to the tuner, could you come and untune my piano, please? Because it's getting back into tune.
Yes. Yeah, there's I'm going to call on Joe and then Richard in just a moment. I'm going to add into the comments another critical distinction the Greeks always made that was central to their understanding is cosmos versus chaos. And for us, we distinguish chaos from order, right? And that usually means law and order, and chaos usually means anyone who challenges the established order are causers of chaos who will get us all killed, right? There's sort of this criticism of early 20th century anarchy built into this and law and order kind of thing going on. That's not what the Greeks meant at all by these terms. To the metaphor of a cosmos, the cosmos originally comes from the word for a squad, a military squad that operates together so well that they're like a single organism, in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and could not exist without the parts, and in which the parts are wholes of their own by themselves while simultaneously being part of the larger order. And so there is this dialectical relationship between the part and the whole in which they need each other to create each other and reinforce each other. And the Greeks saw a well-functioning military squad, a cosmos, as their metaphor for all living organisms, that a life form is the same way. Its parts are actually part of the whole, and the whole is made up of the parts, but is greater than the sum of the parts, and that they reinforce each other and protect each other across the layers. It's not the case that the whole exploits the parts, because then it would be destroying the conditions of its own existence. And neither is it the case that the parts, exploit and tear apart the whole for their own benefit, because then again, the whole would fall apart, which means the part would fall apart. They saw this interdependency of the part and the whole. And for them, the reason that we call the universe the cosmos, they saw all of the larger scales of organic order that make up nature as being a cosmos. And they said the alternative is a chaos. When the parts are working against each other, then you can't create a larger organism. Then it's just mechanical order and things fall apart, as we hear in quote after quote. And you'll see a number of cosmologies that came out of the Greek myths where they say in the beginning was chaos, and that what made it alive and divine was when the logos brought it together into a cosmos, when it could start to become a whole, like the musicians playing off the same scale, when they could all start to help each other and be part of a greater thing. Then a greater thing could be created that could then in turn reinforce them, and they could reinforce it, and you get a living system. So there is an intrinsic idea of living systems, living order, and how living things unfold over time that's just built into the basic idea of the way the Greeks see all organization, including the universe. Joseph and then Richard.
I mean, isn't it critical though that the whole be able to fall apart? I mean, chaos essentially is kind of critical to the whole process of being able to reinvent yourself to begin with. So it's not necessarily a negative thing, but it can be turned into a positive thing where you kind of fall apart and then you kind of grow into something else that's actually better. So there's that aspect of it too. And were we talking about the idea more of Gestalt theory? Is that where we're kind of going with the idea of the sum and the whole?
Yeah, Gestalt theory draws off of these ancient Greek ideas.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was that was just a quick question. And the last thing I just wanted to say, the idea of also engaging with the unknown aspect of things and the power of myth, that's where that myth allows us to engage with chaos, but it also creates a problem at a certain point, because when the myth becomes the dogma,
right,
then
we're in trouble.
Then the system itself becomes immutable. So then, or infallible. So then we all of a sudden we have a problem, because then we can't reinvent ourselves based, and our beliefs can't change.
Yes.
So we have a closed system and things just fall apart. Anyway, I know my thoughts were all over the place, but
no, to me that was all about the same thing, and I'm just going to take a sec to underscore it. From the Greek perspective, the cosmos has no chaos. The concept of chaos theory is an Apollonian concept, and it's an attempt to represent the truth that our ideas about the laws and order of the universe are wrong. And that from the perspective of our ideas, some of the things that the cosmos does look to us within that framework like chaos, but they aren't chaos, because the universe would fall apart then, and it doesn't. So the truth is that the cosmos's order is deeper and more subtle and sophisticated, and involves transformations and changes over time that we don't yet understand. So its order is without chaos. But by contrast, when we try to model it, or try to think thoughts of our own, be rational, reasonable, when we try to put together economic systems or legal systems, those things are merely aping the cosmos. We're trying to create an artificial cosmos. And because it's not a natural cosmos, we make a lot of mistakes in the way we do it. For example, we do a lot of mechanistic order instead of organic order. And mechanistic order is incapable of creating a true cosmos. It can create sort of a fake cosmos, but that cosmos is going to have those rigidities you talked about that get us into trouble, because they don't actually match the world, and they don't allow us to be whole human beings. And so as a result, the creative destruction of our artificial systems of norms and laws is an essential part of replacing them with something better, something that's more organic, more whole, more natural, more profound, more humane than what we've done so far. And so, like a lot of things, this chaos versus cosmos thing becomes, it depends on the context. It becomes a paradox. Sometimes, some contexts, chaos is not only bad, but impossible, because the cosmos doesn't have any chaos. But in other contexts, it's necessary, like when we're trying to break up, stultified, stale systems that are holding us back. I think it's Marianne, then Richard, then James, then Dowdy.
Or I think I was...
Oh, go ahead, Richard.
Oh, yeah, because I wanted to build upon the momentum of this train of thought here.
Sure.
So, I think this goes to what you were just saying. I think, like kind of the rigidity, but I think it also like goes back earlier to Phil that I'm commenting on. So, this process of moving to a keyboarded instrument, like this process of a Procrustean bed, it actually happened twice. So like on a keyboard, you can't have the intermediate pitches between like semitones, like between the keys, right? Mm-hmm. But what we think of the scale, like, and like how our instruments are tuned, what we call 12-tone equal temperament, like how all the different scales sound the same, just kind of at a different starting pitch. That is a relatively modern standard, like a 20th century standard. So the music, of Bach, of Mozart, of Beethoven, of Chopin, they were often not played in those times using a 12-tone equal temperament. You had slightly different spacings between the different keys, and so depending which key you were working in, like between the different major scales, those slightly different spacing, like that kind of organic nature, it would give those different key signatures a different temperament, a different kind of feeling. And so like a music that's in the key signature of A major or D flat major or whatever, like that would come with it. Like there's actually like a table it would evoke certain feelings just by saying this is in this key signature. So that kind of but like I think it's become so part of the episteme that we don't even really realize that we've done this thing that's false, and we've kind of lost. So if people are familiar with Bach, and he published the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Yes.
So that was his sort of celebration in response to, at that time, the creation of what. So well does not just mean. So well temperament was a specific tuning. It doesn't just, that's not just meaning it's done well. It's
Right.
a specific tuning. And because prior to that, the pervasive tuning was mean tone temperament, which is a slight improvement on Pythagorean temperament. But what it did happen though, is that the schlop, because of making certain intervals sound pure and full integer ratios, the schlop was kind of pushed around in certain keys, and you ended up with most of the schlop on like A flat and E flat, which is supposed to be like a perfect fifth. But when you actually play that perfect fifth in a mean tone tempered instrument, it sounds horrible. It's called the wolf tone. And one of Bach's things to do sometimes is he would go to, I think maybe during this transition period, like if he was in a church and they had a pipe organ and it was tuned in mean tone, he would play that temperament to like hurt the ears of like the people working there. But yeah, so like by having well tone, or well temperament, he was able to then create write 24 preludes and fugues in all of those major keys. Yeah. Anyway, that's sort of my long dissertation. My quick thing is, when you talking about how myth now is grounded in the truth, it kind of reminds me of that Orwellian's famous kind of war is peace, freedom and slavery, ignorance is strength. And I think kind of by extension, in our world now, myth is lies, right? We've sort of turned it upside down.
We have, yeah. Oh my goodness, I never thought about that before. It's like another Orwellian statement to say a myth is a lie. Yeah, thank you. That's going to stick with me.
Thank you.
Okay, Marianne, then Dowdy.
So when you were talking about chaos, the parts working against the whole, I was thinking of neoliberalism and the narcissistic attitude. And I was trying to combine that private intelligence as kind of a narcissistic thing. And so I kind of don't know how we can work, can we even conceive of working towards the whole presently? So I wanted to ask you that.
It's boy, you're asking the right question. It's a profound problem, and it's a necessary problem to confront. When we talk about colonizer cultures versus indigenous cultures, and we were trying to figure out how to characterize them in a way that we could understand, one of the characterizations is that an indigenous culture forms a whole with its land and habitat that it is in. And because the land and habitat are not abstract land, but are a specific place with specific cycles through the year and so on, it means the culture has to be a specific culture with specific festivals and celebrations and relationships to the land. It can't be a generic one because this place is different from all other places. It has to fit it. There's this thing that Christopher Alexander talks about, I've alluded to before, about architecture that's organic is fitted to its circumstances. And so you wouldn't just stamp out a bunch of identical houses, because every house is in a different place and they might have a different view. And so you might want to move the window a little to the left or a little to the right so that it's actually, there's an amazing view of a mountain, but not from where it was stamped out generically, only if you shift it to go look at that thing. And that's an example of the kind of tuning process in which iteratively, incrementally over time, you could build wisdom into things by step, tuning them to fit the whole better and better, and likewise tuning the whole to fit its inhabitants. That's what's happened with an indigenous culture. It wasn't somebody's grand design, Apollonian, Verstand, noetic, that they just sat down and said, I have a great idea for a culture, here it is, now let's all live that way. It was something that evolved iteratively over time from the process of finding the mismatches and adjusting them and tuning them up until you finally end up with a unique culture that's not like any other culture on Earth, because it's not in any other place on Earth. And it didn't come from any other roots the way that these guys did. So it's one of the big differences between colonizer cultures. They have this abstract, generic, imposing themselves the same way on all places kind of quality, like a universal melting pot or machine that's going to erase all differences. Whereas indigenous cultures create these larger wholes by paying attention to the concrete specifics. The begriff of the situation gets fully treated and not just suppressed as some kind of unpleasant subjectivity. And the result is that with a noetic Apollonian culture, you sit down and design it, and now you can say this is what it will be like. But with a begriff culture, an indigenous culture, where you're forming wholes, you don't know in advance what it will be like. The design is emerging over time. There's a bonus of mystery and ongoing creativity such that you may back yourself without ever realizing it into the most extraordinary things that you never could have imagined in advance. It's one of the differences. So I know that sort of tangentially addresses what you're saying, but it was what you made me think of. Dowdy, go ahead. I think you're on. Are you on mute?
Okay, does this work?
There you go. Yeah,
okay.
There you are.
Yeah, great to be on here again. Excellent
Good
conversation as always. Just a couple of questions.
Please.
I'm wondering, like, how does the Greek conception of the cosmos, how does it deal with Hades? How does it deal with death and the afterlife? And then sort of looking at it from, of course, a Western Christian lens, and like hell is kind of here, but it's not here, and we don't really know where it is. So I'm wondering in that fact. Secondly, let's see, I wrote some down. I would just say, I wonder how, if the species is like, or I would say anything in the cosmos has to have tension. Like there's a part of trying to like be cooperative and be a part of a whole, but like there's also the fact of it being like a sports game,
yes.
Even if it's like a tennis match, and like tension is what allows for the spontaneity, and the spontaneity is what produces life. So
yes.
Like trying to get to a whole is kind of counterproductive in a sense, because we're seesawing and we have to seesaw somewhere, and that seesawing requires a tug of war. So I wonder how that plays in part with even going to what Marianne just asked and what you had just mentioned, because I'm still trying to understand the colonizer colonized mentality, because it seems like there's like organic parts of colonizer culture and there's like inorganic parts of indigenous cultures, unless you like they're totally untouched, in that which case I feel like it would be a inevitable that like a colonizer culture would come on, and like who's to say that doesn't, in a sense, like British colonization did allow untouchables to get educated, and like that's really good. Who knows when that would have happened in India had the British not come. And so like it's really like it really need to strive for, in a sense, this is a question: should we really be striving for a balance as opposed to a like becoming one of the whole, or becoming utter chaos like we need to be? So these are my two quick questions.
Well, thanks. you just pulled a Sharon, Dowdy, because you just put your finger right on the center of the whole thing. Heraclitus is definitely the philosopher for you, because he's all about creative tension. What we're going to get to in these quotes is that he believes the cosmos is not created out of a peaceful balance or compromise, but it's created out of tension, different fundamental principles, each of which is a fountain of order and generating things. They're not all consistent with each other, and the interactions between them create these tensions and these tug of wars that have to be resolved through a Hegelian synthesis into a new direction. New directions are created by the conflict between old directions that are incompatible with each other. And so he says war is the father of all things, as his metaphor for what the logos looks like in the cosmos. He says that the fundamental laws of the universe push against each other. They aren't all dancing in one happy, absolutely smooth thing, but there's struggle involved, and that struggle is not just an interesting feature, but it's where order comes from. Mm-hmm. When he talks about his famous quote is, "The hidden harmony is best." And what he'll talk about is that the hidden harmony is a result of the struggle and the tension and the reconciliation of opposites. That's why he talks about paradox so much and struggle. So we're going to get to those quotes today. It's they're part of what we're talking through. So he would agree with you. He's that what we're looking for is not a simple static passive order. The universe doesn't work that way. But the way the universe works is through dynamic order and transformation and interaction and struggle. And that makes it very hard for us to figure out how to organize human affairs, because we'd rather not have our civilizations collapsing all the time. But when you look at the world around you, things are constantly in transformation. So like, how can we make an ongoing thing at the same time that everything around us is changing? That goes right to the heart of Heracliteanism. So it's not. I haven't answered your question, but I have said you've come to the right place. Heraclitus is your guy. He's all about the things you're saying. This is his thing. Phil, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I want to share something that I learned from a professor at Penn State in philosophy about how myth lost its power through reductionism. And he said, if you just start out with myth, if you break it down, the myth is really a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
And then once you got that breakdown, a metaphor is, well, it's a simile. It's like this and that, okay? And a simile is really an analogy.
Mm-hmm.
An analogy is really something that creates a list of properties, okay? And so then you have a list of being, and then you have a list of non-being, okay? So once you get to that point, then in a sense, it really comes down to like, in a sense, being and nothingness. And he ends up by saying, I'll take the being, I'll take the ice cream, you can have the nothing. so that's how reductionism has caused myth to, in a sense, be the non-ice cream.
Yes, it doesn't like the excluded middle. Right?
He said it in a funny way, but nonetheless, I think that reductionism,
yes,
in a sense, that has to do with a logical reduction.
Yes,
in a sense, through that way. Of course, a lot of contemporary thinkers are thinking now, no, it's actually there's a lot of stuff in the nothing that's important to bring back. So that was an important enlightening moment to me to understand, like, okay, if myth could be broken down that way, it's just a kind of, let's say, a language trope that finally is reduced to a kind of thing that really should be cast away because we got the real list now.
Right.
So
that's the critique of classical Greek culture. That as they got more Apollonian, they became reductionists. They embraced the law of the excluded middle, and they ripped out all this qualitative, fecund, creative stuff in the middle that Science 1 is based on, and became obsessed with Science 2 and the little systems and rules. And this is what we've concluded. So this is what must be true. And if that was happening right during Socrates' lifetime, it was with him, with the sophists, with Plato, before him with Parmenides, after him with more sophistry. And
he was a Plato scholar.
Yeah, that era was the rejection, growing rejection of mythos culture and its replacement with a sort of mechanized, over-systematized noetic approach to thinking. But when we go to Heraclitus, we find he's fully mythic. He is rigorous and demanding, but not at all in the way that Plato and others are. So let me take us to a few more quotes. I know, Dowdy, I didn't address the Hades question. It'll be easier to address later after we get into this. But rest assured, it's part of the Heraclitean War is the father of all things. Is where he gets at the nature of the afterlife and how that works. So the next relevant quote after these first two big ones is, "Man is not rational. Only what encompasses him is intelligent." And so this is his way of saying there's two different kinds of reason. There's two different kinds of intelligence. There's what human beings do, and that's grossly inadequate. It doesn't deserve to be called reason, because when we look at the universe and we see how it reasons out, the order that it generates, it's just mind-boggling. It's just astonishing that all of these things could be created at all these levels of order out of the organization and logic and intelligence that's behind the cosmos. And when we look at things that people make, it's, on the one hand, we're often impressed by ourselves because it's the coolest thing we've ever made. But if we put it side by side with natural things, it's always shocking how crude and primitive it is, what a short lifespan it has, how little it does, how it doesn't grow or heal itself or adapt. The cat versus toaster comparison that Tom Munneke from my medical informatics community comes from is a classic example, because we could say, well, the toaster is actually, if you think about how much technology and civilization did it take to develop mining and metallurgy, purification, manufacturing processes, just an enormous thousands of years of labor went into making a toaster, and yet the damn thing can't heal itself. I knock it against the wall and put a dent in it, and that dent's forever. I could pound it back out, but it's not going to fix itself. But a cat scratches itself, and a week or two later, it's fine again. It rebuilds itself constantly. It's like, how can a cat be so much more sophisticated than a space shuttle? The space shuttle, every time we flew it, fell apart. Tiles fell off of it. Bolts got loose. That's why they didn't do back-to-back flights. They had to decommission it after every flight and go back over the whole thing with a fine-tooth comb and get it all working again, because it had mechanical order, not organic order. It wasn't organizing itself. It was passive and had to be organized from without. And so in that, you can see the difference between what we call intelligence when we're praising ourselves for how smart we are, and what the cosmos has as the intelligence that's evidently unconsciously just in everything. The tendency of atoms to organize into elements, the tendency of elements to interact with each other and form larger structures, the tendency, given enough time and circumstances, for living structures to emerge on their own, right? And to self-organize into organisms and into people who could pat themselves on the head for how smart they think they are. Nature just did all of that. Kind of profligate is the word I always use when talking about nature's intelligence and creativity. I hold up my finger and I can't even count how many cells there are in even my fingernail, but especially in the living tissue. And in the living tissue, each and every one of those cells is more sophisticated than the most sophisticated machine a human being has ever made, because it heals itself. It builds itself. It reproduces itself. It interacts with the environment in order to grow and spread. And, there's nothing we've made that could do that. It's like, we can't even amount to the level of a single invisible cell as far as level of intelligence. So, Heraclitus's criticism is well taken here. It's not that we're completely stupid, right? We work really hard to achieve the things that we achieve, but we have to understand that it's a different level of intelligence than what he calls the divine intelligence of the cosmos, that's capable of doing things at just mind-boggling levels of organization and sophistication. They're different in kind. And if we ever think that we are going to be able to sum up and fully characterize the intelligence of the cosmos by using human intelligence, we got another thing coming. All we're ever going to be doing is modeling. And that's what science tells us at its best. Science tells us we don't have the truth, we're modeling the truth. That comes right out of Heraclitus. And this is where the three levels of the Greek cosmos come into play, because the next fragment is human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. And so we're dealing with three different levels here: the human, the divine, and the natural, right? Which we talked about before, in which under the ancient worldview, the natural is the source of all meaning and wisdom and intelligence. And the next lower level down is the divine, because the divinities in the ancient world are expressions of nature. They're kind of focal points, concentrations of the things that have authority over us. But every one of them is superior to us because they have authority over us and we don't have authority over them in return. It's a one-way hierarchical relationship. And that they contain, part of the reason to postulate these divinities is to help make concrete how much cooler it would be if we could be like that. So what if we could think? What if we could say something that was actually true and didn't contain at least some shadow of error, but was true in all ways for all times? What if we could look at a tree and understand it as it actually is, and not in some weird, limited, aspectival, glancing mortal way? So that's beyond us. And that's why the ancients said we need the layer of the divine as one of the sources of meaning to understand what is above us, what is better than us, so that we can be aspirational. If we don't postulate a divine and characterize it as best we can to describe what has authority over us and what's better than us, it encourages us to not be aspirational and to settle. And that leads to the downward path, right? In which we settle for less and less and less until finally we find ourselves being kind of nihilistic, anomic, alienated wage slaves and not understanding why we don't feel a satisfied life and why we don't feel connected to anything. He talks about the path upward and the path downward in other places. And this is part of what he means. We need this hierarchy of meaning to help frame us so that we will aspire to do better. Richard, you got your hand up.
So this is a philosopher I've brought up a couple times in this group as well, like that I'm also studying another group. And we just recently kind of had this discussion last Friday, and it was really insightful. So this is Rene Gerard.
Yes.
Who is very much like wanting to understand like human nature, violence, conflict. And so this gets to kind of like his theories of mimesis, and then also mimetic rivalry, where when you have an external mediator or model that you look up to, that you revere, external meaning you don't come into competition. So even like in the days of like when we had like royalty of the kings, like, you know, like what the king's interests are, like you're not going to be able to like come into contact with that. But sort of in like kind of a you know, like as our societies have progressed, like kind of one of the consequences is that like by everyone sort of being equal, but we're trying to still kind of worship something. Like we get into what's called internal mediation now, where you can get into competition or get into conflict. And you know, and then like as it gets really bad, you can get kind of locked in what we call like then even further double mediation, and then you get this rivalry which then spirals. And so he draws upon, you know, this human behavior a lot from novelistic works, Dostoevsky, Proust, and we sort of see that like, you know, in critiquing like bourgeois society, there's always this kind of search like upwards for status, for meaning, but when everyone's sort of equal, it's illusory. And he kind of coins this, is this permanence of nothing.
Yes.
Of nothingness.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. When we characterize the ancient worldview, we see built into it this idea of a hierarchy of meaning that says all opinions are not equal, right? And we can see that from the diagram of the two people looking at the world, and the world is different from either one of them, and their ideas are different from each other, right? Because we can use the actual world as a metric to evaluate our different ideas, and the ideas that are in better alignment with the actual world are actually better ideas than the ideas that are inferior versions of describing the real world. That it's okay to make a value judgment. In fact, it's necessary to make a value judgment. You know, the medieval worldview asserted that God was the source of all meaning and nothing else had any meaning at all. So there was an uncrossable gulf between this omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence of the divine and the worthless nothingness of the human beings who could only exist by divine grace and only have meaning by divine grace. And so we had to kind of fall on our knees and prostrate ourselves before and praise the divine in the hopes that the divine would save us from what would otherwise be uselessness. There's what Nietzsche characterized as the slave mentality was built into the medieval version of Christianity, that we are to be slaves to an infinite, all-wise master. But even though the ancient world was a slave world, it was not an absolute form of slavery, the way that the medieval conception of the human relationship to the divine was an absolute slavery, because the Greeks thought you could buy your way out of slavery. Why not? You know, you do your work, save your money, buy your way out. Now you're free because you've just demonstrated your capacity to control your appetites enough to, you know, get control over your own economics. So for them, you know, it was supposed to be that you were a slave if you couldn't control yourself. But if you could control yourself, then, you know, you wouldn't be a slave anymore. This was to the Athenian version of slavery, this was essential. And they were trying to mimic the relationship between the human and the divine, in which even though the divinities are better than we are and of a different order, it doesn't mean that there's an uncrossable gulf between them. In the Greek myths, there are constantly people being elevated to godhood. and there are gods walking around on earth like human beings and, insulting each other and getting angry and cutting their foot. And I mean, they have a very human quality to them. And the reason for that was to tell us that there is not an excluded middle. Despite the enormous gap between them, we can strive to do better. We can strive to lift ourselves up, to be more creative, more kind, to have higher standards, to do good for more people. We can try to be more divine-like and follow the examples, and that it's worth doing, because we are not an infinite vacuum of meaning under the ancient world order the way that we are under the medieval world order. We have meaning intrinsically in ourselves because we're part of nature, just like everything else is part of nature. And nature is the source of meaning. So I'll come to you in a sec, Phil, but I think first Dowdy and then Marianne.
Yeah, just can you guys hear me this time?
Yeah, you sound
awesome.
Great.
Yeah, just two quick questions. I wanted to actually ask one based upon what you just said. Is there, in sort of Greek thought, if I wanted to be Aries or something horrible, could I strive to be that? Or is it just is there a very sort of moral like goodness that is necessary in order for an individual to reach divinehood? And sort of the second point, I wonder if this, I don't know if I'm not too well versed in the Greeks, but the constant distinction between or the constant differing between humankind and nature, and sort of this goes back to your explanation of the toaster, sort of the extrapolation of an organism into the making of a toaster is on one string, and so why is there, maybe this is rhetorical, why do we all often put human nature in juxtaposition with like the natural world, because the humans by the fact of being are the natural world, and so like everything we create is just nature, as a bird creates a nest, and we wouldn't look upon birds and say, well, look how primitively or dumbly they're trying to like get to truth. That would be absurd. And so like what we create is spectacular, and but I'm also like wondering, why is there I suppose a lot of philosophers do this when they say human nature and then natural nature, or even if that's a valid question to have, because I don't even know if that's the right question that I'm asking. Am I just splitting hairs, or
oh,
like,
no.
is that something that I'm...
No, you're doing another share and you're asking the good stuff here. Let me see if I can tackle it a little bit for you. So these two questions have slightly different answers. So the first question about could you become Aries? So the Greeks saw an example of the realm in between the divine and the human as being the realm of the heroes, like Achilles. And part of what made them different is that they exemplified virtues, individual virtues, so completely and profoundly that thereafter it became impossible to understand that virtue without citing the example of the person, because the person made what seems like an abstract virtue tangible in human life so that people could learn it. And that was their purpose, and that was the highest calling a human being could have, is to study virtue and try to embody virtue in your own life to such an extent that you became the example that civilization could build around. And that was why, for example, Achilles' famous choice in the lead up to the Trojan War, does he want a long, happy life or a short, well, we translate it as famous life or glorious life, but what he was after was a short life of virtue in which he could transcend the limited mortal domain by becoming a virtuoso, by becoming the exemplar, so that when people wanted to teach about courage and prowess in battle, they would always talk about Achilles. And it wasn't just to exalt himself, but so that by clarifying what those virtues are, it would make it easier for subsequent generations to follow the example, because now they had one of how a human being could live in order to fully realize courage in their lives. And so the idea was that, there's a number of different virtues that people need to cultivate in order to be better than our default case or our worst case. And that we need to get clearer and clearer about what those virtues are. We need to explore them, study them, just like they studied the polytheistic deities. And that they conflict with each other and challenge each other. It's difficult to exemplify too many virtues at the same time. But if you exemplify one virtue completely out of balance with the others, it becomes more of a tragedy. This is what the tragedies were often about, is somebody who went too far one way and not enough the others. And so if you could somehow have a human life in which you brought a virtue to life without losing your balance, then we needed that. because it would help us to understand the incredible complexity, for example, of how do you be a kind person with all the obligations you have in society pulling you every which way. So that's the answer to the first part of your question, is that that's what they saw as the route for transcendence. Heraclitus' great strength, right? Theseus's cleverness, Achilles' courage in battle. These guys exist in order, they were people, and they existed in order to help us to see how a person can rise up and do better so that subsequent generations can follow their example. The second part of your question, I just lost track of. Say a part of it again, just a little bit to bring me back to it.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering sort of the difference between, or why there's a differentiation between.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it. Yes, the artificial and the natural. So Heraclitus talks about this, and Hegel talks about it a lot. But Heraclitus, he's building on Heraclitus. And the idea is this. I'm going to go back to the second fragment I quoted. And it is this part. The third sentence of the second fragment. My own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature, to specify how it behaves. Other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. Now, it's easy to read this sentence and think that the point is sleepwalking, because that's so potent and powerful. But, Heraclitus worked this sentence over for a long time before he wrote it down. Around and within is important, because remember, he said elsewhere, man is not rational, only what encompasses him, what is around him is intelligent. So nature is around us, right? It's all around. We can look outside ourselves and see the natural world and see that it's organized according to a logos. It has a nature, and the nature is a kind of intelligence that generates all of its qualities and transformations. But he's saying it's not enough to just see what's going on around you. You also have to see what's going on within you, because we, as part of nature, just like a tree has its tree nature and a river has its river nature, we have our human nature. Nature acts inside of us. And in each of these cases, we have our own sets of rules, our own logos, that is consistent with the larger nature, but is tuned up for our specific situation. That if we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand that nature. You don't know a tree until you know tree nature. You don't know a river until you know a river's nature. And you can't know yourself, noesis saoten, until you understand human nature generally and your own specific nature concretely. So he saw that everything that people do is a working out of nature. We are part of the natural order. We are natural creatures. We are subject to the logos within us, the acting out of nature within us, what the hydrogen does, what the helium does, what the cells do, what the blood tissues do in the immune system, the way that the mind forms thoughts. We're subject to all of that. That's our nature that we inhabit, along with the nature that's outside of us. But paradoxically, at the same time that we are part of nature, we have this unerring instinct for thinking thoughts that are completely out of sync with nature. The human mind naturally produces alienated, abstract, incorrect ideas. It is a capacity to be artificial that is in us and part of our nature. It's not the case that we are either artificial or natural. Heraclitus loves a good paradox, and there's no paradox about human nature better than this one, that we are natural and artificial at the same time. That the part of the noetic part of our mind is a drive for artifice, to imitate, to mimic, to create, to generate, to systematize, to organize. And all that systematizing and organizing is done mostly in its own terms, instead of being done in terms of the larger cosmos outside of ourselves that we don't understand. This is why our models can be so wrong, right, about reality, and why the societies that we create can be so artificial, because the capacity to generate artifice is naturally a part of us, even though it puts us out of sync with the larger world. So, it's like most gazelle will run from a lion. Their nature doesn't include as wide a scope of ideas as our nature does, even though nature made us both. Just like our nature doesn't make us rooted in the ground and photosynthesize with leaves growing out of our fingers, right? I mean, our nature is specific. It's not abstract. We are not all things. We are human things. And as part of human things, we have the capacity to see a hungry lion charging at us and do what no gazelle would ever do, which is go, I don't believe that lion is real, and I'm going to prove it by standing here. And if it does eat me, that's not really happening. I'm actually transcending my mortal flesh and moving to the world of spirits and living there. Right? We can come up with these ideas that a gazelle would never come up with because we have a capacity for alienation and artifice that Hegel writes about extensively. So the answer is both at the same time. We naturally can produce artifice, to an extent that most animals can't. It's part of our, God help us, it needs quotation marks. It's part of our gift. Marianne and then Ginny.
When you were speaking about the slaves in Greek being able to work their way out of it, I was thinking of American meritocracy. And also I was thinking of the Nazi concentration camp where they say your work will set you free. And there was, and I think I have the word for it now, there was one man who was in the concentration camp who created to me the best definition of freedom. And it was like, they can take my body, they can take everything, but they can't take my freedom.
Yes.
And that has always moved me. And then I was thinking, well, maybe that's the third way.
Yes. Yes. It's part of the great tragedy of the concentration camps is that they would so brutally, Viktor Frankl, that they would so brutally put Arbeit macht frei over the gate, promising you a meritocracy when what they're delivering is extermination and apocalypse, and that they intended to deliver extermination and apocalypse, and that they would deploy sacred language in such a cynical, callous way is a horror. It's like the ethics of the Holocaust are right there in that grotesque diremption between what they promised and what they delivered. And part of what's remarkable about Viktor Frankl is his ability to take that broken promise and turn it back into what the Nazis wouldn't give their inmates, which is concentration camp, you want me to concentrate? I will find the distinction between true freedom and physical freedom. I will locate it in this horror, and then I will write books about it and share it with people for all time so that they can.
Logotherapy.
Yeah, right. Logotherapy. Try to get some wisdom out of this horrible thing. Try to do some emotional alchemy. Some cognitive, meaningful alchemy. So I'm glad you brought that up. Ginny and then Richard.
Well, before we close up, I just wanted to say once more, as I have done many times, Professor Marshall, what a wonderful professor you would be. It's a shame that your students, potential students, would not be able to take advantage of your knowledge. And are you a father, by the way, Rick?
I'm not. I only have cats.
Oh, you only have cats. That's another thing. You would be a tremendous father too, I would imagine. Anyway.
You're killing me, Jenny. You're killing me.
I know, but
just a student.
Right, Sharon? You agree with me, right?
Yes, but are you really a professor, Rick? I'm on the East Coast. I don't know anything about these guys. You guys. No. You're not a professor?
But he ought to be. Don't you think?
I wanted to be. But in my teen years, when I saw how badly we treat teachers and professors, I decided not to be. But it's I want to be. It's part of why I enjoy doing this with you guys. It's like, this is.
But you would be just a fantastic philosophy instructor to, let's say, teenagers.
Well,
teenagers who are troubled and confused and what?
They don't get to have me. Only you guys do. For warts and all, I'm all yours. I just do these Monday seminars.
Yeah.
But thank you for saying
if you and this goes to Dave Rowell. I mean, if you would consider doing this every Monday, I would be just as happy.
I do every Monday, but we go
every
till
Monday. It is every Monday.
Yeah, it is every Monday.
This Mythos is every Monday?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think it's not been posts like I think it's been falling. Sorry, David, this is not meant as a criticism, but like the post actually dropped off, I guess. David Roll.
That's my fault. It's because of me.
Okay. Oh, okay.
The last 2 weeks I didn't.
Why did I think? I don't know. For some reason, I thought it was every other Monday. Oh well.
During the holidays, we never took a break. Even during the holidays, like not a single.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
what's happening is that I'm not writing my intros for the last 2 weeks, and so David was waiting for my intro and then gave up and sent the invite without it. So that's why you didn't see the invites as much. But yeah, we're doing them every week. And we go until we go another hour. We're not done yet.
Wait a minute. Well, you're going until 4 o'clock?
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, I've brought that up, but they sort of said they're keeping the status quo. Yeah, it's officially to 1, but or I guess in your case till 4, but it's always been till 5. It's always been 3 hours. Sorry,
it's a 3 hour.
It's been 3 hours.
It's a 3-hour seminar.
I'm just having a confused day here. So sorry.
No, because it says 2 hours on the invite, so it's understandable you'd be confused. But we always go 3. Richard, go ahead.
Always go 3.
Yeah,
okay.
The best stuff comes. No, I'm joking. So this isn't really like, I've been bringing this up like whenever I hear like kind of going to the Nazis. It's not so much this conversation, but I think sort of just kind of like kind of just bring reality, like kind of and then comfortable reality, and so that Germany like looked as a mediator, as a model to the United States and study its history of genocide, of slavery. And then specifically of its Jim Crow laws in fashioning its Jewish, anti-Jewish exclusion laws. And like their plans weren't originally to eliminate the Jews.
Right.
Like they thought that they would win the war quickly, and then they would be able to like ship all them off somewhere.
Yes.
Right. And then but anyway,
But they couldn't win quickly, and nobody else wanted them, because everybody else was just as anti-Semitic as they were. They were just more methodical and systematic about it, which is what's so
I forgot the name of the ship that's like they were filled full of refugees, like crossed the Atlantic, and then they were like out there for months, and they couldn't find any country, Canada, United States, to take them, and eventually they had to go back.
St. Louis.
Yeah.
And Anne Frank died because we turned the ship back. She was on the ship that was coming to America, and she got sent back with her family, and that's why she died. It's because America didn't want Jews either. And before I call on Phil, one more thing that they were using as an example is Hitler toured the Indian reservations, and he was full of praise for how, as he put it, rigorous and ruthless we were in following our ideologies. And he wanted to do the same thing. And so he made the concentration camps in imitation and homage to the way that we treated slaves and indigenous peoples.
Okay. And then
it's horrific, of course. But
in combination now, with even further industrialization, right? So it's very much, very much now, like we see it, this anti-myth, right? Of America, the victor of World War II, like leading the forces of democracy and freedom and good against evil, So
yes. Well, and Heraclitus is all over this too, because Hitler grew up reading American Wild West romances written by a German author. And he fantasized about the idea of an untamed wilderness, and that civilized people could go into that wilderness and spread their country. And that's what he wanted to do in Eastern Europe. He saw Eastern Europeans and Slavs as the new Native Americans of Europe, and that he wanted to expand Germany east and take all that land so to create a greater Germany, just like there was a greater United States. He fantasized of making a European United States, to the extent that he wanted all German soldiers to read those specific books. I can't remember. Was it Karl May? I can't remember. No, I can't remember the name of the author of the West.
Karl May. Yeah. The Winnetou books. Like
he wanted them to read those Westerns so that they would have the same dream that he had. And so what's happening is he's interacting with the real world of Eastern Europe as though it is the imaginary world of Karl May's Wild West. And so there's sort of a double layer of abstraction there, because of course the Wild West was nothing like the Americans imagine it. It was nothing like Karl May imagined it. And in either case, Eastern Europe was nothing like either of those. But he was, by living in this abstracted Verstand noetic world, with his private intelligence, he was imposing that upon reality and did an enormous amount of damage to the world because of the diremption between his private intelligence and the truth in the world itself. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something we talked about earlier about nature and human beings, part of nature and part of not nature. I was thinking specifically of the surrealists and then the Dadaists, because I'm an artist.
Yes.
And it seems to me like the struggle is not only in some way to harmonize with nature, but because the system of civilization has become so powerful that the surrealists always had exercises where they want you to look at familiar object in the strangest way possible.
Yes.
So you have a kind of a small peephole and opening into some other reality. Okay?
Yes.
And the Dadaists just want to, in a sense, go in a system of domination so it could go outside of that system as well. And so,
Yes.
so it seems to me the surrealists were not so much trying to recapture the mythic thing as to just to create the opening so that you could enter this other space, right?
Yes.
And that
Yes.
seems like a really, really important thing. It seems to me like with a civilization now that's sort of so structured in a kind of institutionalized all sorts of things,
Yes.
that, you know, like for instance, it took this summer for the Black Lives Matter movement to, in a sense, finally create enough of an opening that many people who didn't see many things began
Yes.
to see something. So in a
Yes.
sense, our struggle is also with civilization itself.
It is.
Well, as,
It is.
just pure existence. There's the second layer that we have to deal with.
Cubism was doing some of the same thing. You know, it goes to why art movements, in modern civilization, we treat art as a mere commodity or decoration, but it's not. It's like hallucinogens. For the record, I don't take hallucinogens, but I understand their role sort of systematically.
Well, I was thinking that same thing, that these act kind of like hallucinogens.
They do, right? The goal is to give us something that can crack the noetic self-consistency of our private intelligence, to open it up and dilate our minds to see that there's more going on in the world than what we think is going on. And I'm going to share my desktop for a second, if I can. It's down here, right? Share screen, to show you a picture. This is Pacific Northwest Coast Indian art. This is a depiction of Raven. And if you know anything about the myths and legends of the Pacific Northwest Coast Indians, you know Raven is a sacred figure. He's a creative figure. He's a force of chaos, but not of the destructive chaos, but the constructive chaos. He's like Coyote from the Southwest. Raven is constantly breaking our expectations, sometimes in ways that, you know, are embarrassing or humorous, but often in ways that open the doors of reality and make things possible. But what's important here is not just that it's a depiction of Raven and a reminder to us to think about that mode of or role in society, but I want you to notice what we have here is two side views of a raven that have been unfolded to show both sides of the raven at the same time. This isn't a front view of a raven. Look how far out the wings and tail are spread. This is two side views of a raven at the same time. This was a common motif in Pacific Northwest Coast Indian art. And the purpose of doing that is to say what Heraclitus is saying, because they arrived at the same conclusion independently on their own, which is that the human perspective is too limited. The world of nature is more complicated than we think it is. We're only perceiving it aspectively or glancingly. And that if we could see in a divine state, like the divinity of Raven, then we would see all sides of things at the same time, multiple sides. So like in Cubism, when they put the eyes on from both sides of the face onto one side, in those weird things like you see in Guernica, the reason for that is they're imitating this art, trying to show you that there's multiple sides to things. That's the first thing that's built into Pacific Northwest Coast art, like the Tlingit art from up in the Alaskan area. There are hundreds of faces inside of the things they depict. And they're unfolded into these giant rectangles full of faces. All the joints have faces, the hands have faces, the feet have faces. It's faces everywhere. And this is based on the idea that there is sacredness in nature and meaning in nature, and significance and capacities everywhere you look at every scale. And that it's too easy to slip into this mortal perspective of thinking that things are the way they appear to us, or they are the way that we treat them, when actually there's so much more. So their entire art style is designed as a slap in the face, literally every time you look at it, to say, no, your perspective is too limited. You're a human being. You need to understand everything is bigger and more sophisticated than you think it is.
Let me just add one more thing that's not directly related to this, but I wanted to say it in relationship to art. When I teach foundation drawing, I'm serious about this. To the end of the class, I want them to know that they actually recognize the rectangle is the field of expression. One thing I want them to realize is that the piece of paper is not just a place in which you deposit images of things.
Right.
I want them to imagine that the piece of paper is actually like a sail in which wind is blowing from the other side, and you have to energize the surface structure as well as depict whatever you're going to depict. And that's a synthetic aspect, because that's the kind of dynamism that I want. And I feel like if you could leave this class and understand that there's a dynamic surface in which you interact, I'll call that even if you learn nothing else.
Yes, exactly.
But that is the beginning of everything that allows it to be a living art form rather than just a mere depiction of something.
Exactly. Yeah, if you read Robert McKee's book Story, about storytelling and script writing for films, he talks a lot about the difference between plot and story. He says, it's astonishing that we don't know the difference. We think that it's just one thing happening after another and that's your plot. He says that's not the point at all. The story is a completely different thing. Film, there are plenty of films that are full of plot but that leave us dry at the end. We don't feel anything because there was no story there. And that to have story, it has to harness the interaction between a human being and the larger world in a way that shows the deeper meaning that our lives are at stake, that there are things that matter in the cosmos that we often can't see, and they need to be dramatized and illustrated for us in a way that makes the invisible, meaning of things visible to us, so that we can orient and realize, oh, I should be worrying less about what this other guy says about me. I should be worrying more about whether I'm doing the right thing, for example, as just one of many, winds that you would fill the sail of the sheet with. You're trying to bring the invisible potencies and powers that rule our lives out into the open and make them visible and dramatic and memorable, so that people can learn the lesson and walk away and go, I'm part of something larger, and I need to think about those larger things. Dowdy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, did the Greeks see the cosmos as a static thing, or did they see it as in flux?
Well, until the Apollonian era, they saw it as dynamic. I mean, Plato's summary of all of Heraclitus's philosophy, which is a gross oversimplification, but is nevertheless potent. Is Panta Hooray. I'll put that in the chat. Panta Hooray. All things flow. Right, in 2 words. And this is why Plato is worth reading, even when he's wrong about stuff a lot of the time. He's an epitomist too. He's trying to boil things down to their essence, and so he tries to boil down this "you can't step in the same river twice" thing as Panta Hooray. Everything's flowing. Everything's becoming. Nature is phusis means becoming. To be natural is to be transforming into something else, to be undergoing aliosis, othering. And that we all contain within ourselves the seeds of our future selves that we don't yet perceive, that we don't know who we're going to be 10 years from now, what we're going to think, what we're going to feel, but that it's already in us as part of our nature, working in us, transforming us in interactions with the larger nature around us. And that's not just the human condition, but the condition of everything else. You can plant a row of 3 trees, and they could be, the same seeds off the same parent tree, and yet all 3 of them grow up slightly differently. because they've got different ones shading them. The sun comes from a different angle. The wind comes from a different angle. Their inner nature is interacting with the outer nature to create the actual form that they unfold as. And so this idea of incremental iterative unfolding is core to the Greek concept of the cosmos and nature. And therefore, it's core to their concept of what it means to be a human being. We live inside of that unfolding, and it's also unfolding inside of us.
Well, I need to come in at this point, because since I'm also an educator, it's like,
yes.
At this particular moment, when so many people are not only trapped in civilization that have certain rules, but now they're trapped in a situation in which if they go to college, which they need to in order to get a skill, they have to, in a sense, predestine what their future is going to be. They're going to be, a dental technician, computer programmer, whatever it is, rather than allowing people to like major in nothing for a while until you figure out what the hell it is that you're going to be, right? It's like that's going to be, it's going to go back to the traditional divide in which the elites are going to be allowed to become human beings, and everybody else are, if they're lucky, allowed to be a trained worker. I mean, it's like it's tremendous, because when I grew up, I had a chance to go to school, and the education, well, it wasn't free, but it was close to being free. That I could actually indulge in something that, for all practical purposes, I should never have been into, because I'm a first generation person, and I went into art, for heaven's sake.
Yes.
And it's like, and also, it's like it's completely contradictory to development what we want people to be, which is be human on some level.
Yeah, exactly. It can't just grow up to be a utility.
Yeah.
The idea that the purpose of education is to make us into a good utility for the economy is grotesque, because the economy itself is also in need of being refactored and re-engineered, as are our politics and our basic assumptions about the world. And it's through art and philosophy and other kinds of kind of creative, mysterious things that we're going to get the power to do that. So why don't I?
They're defunding in the universities.
Well, that's the irony, right? Is as the more conflicts of interest there are, the more people have invested in the status quo, the more they try to defund the sorts of human activities and developments that might challenge or rock the boat.
Well, universities have the partnership with business now.
Yes. So let me try to take us through some more Heraclitus today. Building on this idea in trying to underscore how in order to as a sort of a preemptive refutation of what the sophists would later say when they say man is glorious and the best of all things. In the archaic pre-Apollonian world, he says the handsomest ape is ugly compared with humankind, but the wisest man appears as an ape when compared with a god, in wisdom, in beauty, and in all other ways. We need to be able to conceive of things that are so much better than we are. If we think that we're it, and we're the pinnacle of creation, we're in serious trouble. It does bad things to human thinking. We are at our best when we're aspirational. And so he tells us this, and he says, a man is regarded as childish by a spirit, just as a boy is by a man. So we are not as fully developed as we can yet become. This is where we talk about there not being an infinite gulf between the divine and the human, right? Because a boy doesn't stay a boy forever. A boy can grow up. We could grow up. We could become better than we are. We can and should be doing better. And then he says, what is divine escapes men's notice because of their incredulity. Because of their incredulity. So this is where he starts to talk about the difference between the private intelligence in our head and the common shared intelligence of the cosmos. He's saying our problem is that we're looking right at the world, like he said in that second longer fragment. We're looking right at it. The logos is right in front of our eyes, but we still act as though we're not acquainted with it, because we don't believe nature is what it is actually doing. We instead believe the idea in our head. and we warp our perception of the world to fit the reality in our head. Or if necessary, we erase the thing we're looking at. Either right while we're looking at it, we fail to notice it, or right afterwards, we immediately forget it in order to make it go away so that it doesn't conflict with the idea in our head. So he's saying, when he says the divine nature has real intelligence, he's saying out in the world is all this wisdom about, how the world works and how we could live with it. And we look right at it and we don't see it because we come in with our head full of our own ideas and we disbelieve the truth around us because of our attachment to the truths in our worldview, in our head. I don't know how many of you guys have studied Zen. There's an old classic book on Zen that was popular in the 70s that I have called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. It's all full of these little koans, these little parables. And one of my favorite koans is this guy comes to meet a Zen master because he wants to become wise. And the guy is already heavily educated and knows a lot about the world. And he sits, and the master invites him in to sit down for tea and begins pouring him tea. And he just keeps pouring. And the tea fills up the cup and spills over all over the table. And finally, the guy coming to study wisdom can't stand it anymore. And he speaks out and says, stop, you're pouring tea all over the place. Why are you doing that? He says, because the cup can't accept any more tea because it's already full. The only way you're going to be able to learn something new is if you can dilate your mind to accept new ideas. If you just fill up your head and say, I'm done, and I know all I need to know, then you're not going to be able to learn the greater truths that are around you in the world. You don't have any place for them. And so this is matching up with Heraclitus saying, the problem is we disbelieve it even while it's happening right in front of us. We forget it as quickly as we need to in order to protect the privilege that we've given to our own ideas at the expense of reality. So this goes right to the heart of the philosophy of science, right? He's talking right about the reasons why we have to conduct empirical experiments on our ideas, because we have to let reality challenge them. We have to face reality fully and not just turn away from it because we prefer the ideas that are in our heads. So James and then Phil.
So he was kind of like already observing this kind of logocentrism that, pervaded Western philosophy, according to Nietzsche and Derrida and Heidegger. This kind of centrism that was already in vogue at that time, maybe. Huh?
Yeah, they could see the Banausoi and the douloi. Here's the douloi who are all driven by their feelings and their wants, and they're deciding what to believe based on how it makes them feel. And here are the Banausoi who are choosing what to believe based on how it makes them think, whether it satisfies the system of ideas they have. And both approaches to the world are inadequate because the truth isn't decided by how we feel and it isn't decided by how we think. It's decided by nature. Nature is the source of truth. And that when we turn away from nature towards either of these capacities that are built into our brain, we lose touch of reality and we start becoming sleepwalkers.
Was it Aristotle who came up with the idea, the principle of non-contradiction, and then also the principle of the excluded middle?
Well, I don't think he came up with it, but he systematized it, and he described it more eloquently than anyone before. You can see the excluded middle in Parmenides, when Parmenides is saying it's impossible for there to be change because change is between existence and non-existence, and we know things can exist, and we know they can not exist, so therefore they can't change. It has to be one or the other, because change creates a problem. It's that messy, muddy part in the middle. So Parmenides did that. And I think we'll find that Pythagoras did that too with his focus on mathematics, because mathematics thrives on the excluded middle, right? It's like the ratios are the ratios, and there can't be things that can't be represented by ratios, for example. He's like, ruling out the messy parts. So it's all over this. But Aristotle certainly put it into clear words. Richard, go ahead.
I think Phil was first. Yeah, right.
Oh, Phil, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was going to say that the problem with confronting true logos, I mean, at least in terms of experience, is that, I mean, it seems to me we live in a world in which we live in a number of hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And my thought is, the classic example is that, your platoon, you're out in the woods, and the captain gets killed. Okay. you know there's going to be trouble because like the lieutenant is supposed to take place, but he went to West Point or wherever he went to, and he's got the classic diagrams and all that.
Yes.
And then you look at him and then you look at the sergeant because he's been in the world.
Yes.
He knows what's going on, right?
We'd be better off with the sergeant than the lieutenant.
Exactly. And the problem is the sergeant also knows this, but the sergeant immediately has to go in spite of the fact to the lieutenant and said, what should we do, sir? Right? In order to establish the system that we're dominated by, and then pull him aside later on and discuss in more detail so that the order is maintained, but the knowledge is passed on, right?
Yes.
So in a sense, it's like we always have to tread water because we're constantly living in a system which you have to obey the direct order, but you know that's bullshit, but you can't call it out. It's like we're put in this funny position all the time, right?
Yes. That's the normal human condition, is that we're ruled by the noetic ideas we have about the world, even though they're wrong. No. Even when they're right, they're wrong. They're out of context, right? And we don't know when to apply them.
If you'd be lucky, you have a lieutenant who actually is open enough to accept what the sergeant has to say and incorporate it.
Right. So the Begriff idea that our thinking should be constrained by reality, that we need concrete, tangible experience to leash our minds to reality, is right here in Heraclitus. He's not calling it Begriff. He's not calling it gnosis. He hasn't written out a whole dialectic of the mind, but he's got all the ideas here and he's pitting them against each other and talking about their weaknesses and dangers. Richard, go ahead.
I was just wondering, like in that last aphorism, like talking about like apes and then men and then gods, like I was wondering if you might have any thoughts about contrasting this with like Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch.
Yeah, so Nietzsche was a Hellenophile. He loved the Greeks. He loved Heraclitus. Yeah, in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he says, finally, a philosopher we can really love, we can really get our arms around, because this guy is not full of it. You know, he's like talking about the things that matter. So Nietzsche, like Hegel, is trying to exemplify a lot of these ideas. So his idea of the Übermensch is very similar to the ancient Greek idea of the Aristos, that human beings have an enormous possible variation of who we can be in the world. We can be wonderful, we can be horrible, and we can be somewhere in between. And that it is a duty for us to try not to just let entropy decide who we become. That we shouldn't just lower and lower and lower our expectations until we end up being, afflictions on the world instead of blessings. We should be striving and striving and striving to do better than we have before, to lift ourselves up. And so what he does when Nietzsche says man is a problem that must be overcome, and he's postulating the Übermensch as a replacement for humanity, he's not saying anybody gets to claim they're the Übermensch. So the moment they do that, they're being human, all too human. They're just patting their ego on the head. That the point is the striving and the uplifting and the desire to do better, because you can't, there's limits to how much of a better world you can make unless you make better people. People have to make themselves strive to do better, so that the better angels of our nature allow us to treat each other better and to make a better civilization. That it's essential.
I think you brought up in the past, like this is like the proper understanding of like the will to power, like the personal, like not the will to power over someone else.
Exactly. The Nazis read this and said, yes, we want to have power over Europe. He's singing our song. And there's Nietzsche rolling in his grave going, you idiots. No, you have to overcome your ego. You have to overcome your delusions. You have to overcome your private intelligence and put yourself back into, he was a vitalist. He was all about nature. He wanted the, exuberant natural man dancing the song of life, right? That was his, there's a certain linkage there with Leaves of Grass. I sing the song of myself. He wanted a joyful, powerful, natural, uplifting human being, not sort of a dull, stodgy, everything I think already is perfect and I fit myself into circumstances and never challenge anything kind of human being. He criticized a lot, like Kierkegaard would later, the difference between Jesus and medieval Christians. He's like, how could Jesus be so cool? And so many people who say they're following him could disregard so many of the things he said and do the exact opposite. He says he hated that lowering of our aspirations that came from treating Jesus not as an example, but as a get out of hell free coupon. He's like, Jesus should be a force to lift us up, to make us do better, and say, well, if Jesus could do that, why can't I follow his example? I should try too. But instead, you get these weird morphed versions of Christianity that say, don't bother. All you have to have is faith, and then you get to go to heaven. You don't need to strive. In fact, some versions said, furthermore, it's egotistical to strive, because that seems to imply you think you could save yourself, and you're a worthless worm. Only God can save you. So if you try, if you try to do better, it's an act of ego. That is a variant, of the medieval Christianity that said human beings are worthless and God has all meaning, and so therefore don't strive, just be saved. And that was the warpage of Christianity that Nietzsche hated so much, because it flew in the face of this duty we have to do better, to not accept the defaults in ourselves, to treat people better, to be more honest, to be more courageous, to strive. And that's why he said Übermensch, overman, above us. And he was talking about the heroic Greek ideal. We should try to be virtuosos, while recognizing that we're not and never will be gods. We can at least do a whole lot better than the worst of us. We don't want to. He criticized over and over people letting themselves slide into the human, all too human. Which he wrote a whole book. He titled an entire book, "Human, All Too Human." He said the slack, improvident, slovenly, I'll just melt my way down to being a pretty awful person because it's easy path of humanity. He said we shouldn't do that. We should be doing what Milton said and taking the long, hard, difficult way that leads up into the light. So it's weird, because on the one hand, he gets knocked up a lot for being anti-Christian, but on the other hand, there are some core tenets of Christianity that, he was fierce about, the need to do better.
The perverse side of the person who's absolving themselves with that coupon is is a really lucrative business for the church.
God help us. Yes, that stage of the medieval era that led to the Protestant Reformation, the whole buying and selling of forgiveness, that was just grotesque. So yeah, Nietzsche's Overman. It's all over this, right? It comes right out of this core Greek idea. So what about noesis and Verstand? Well, it gets interesting. So this next fragment from Heraclitus says, let us not make arbitrary conjectures about the greatest matters. Now, when you put that together, when he says what his own method is, which is to look at nature and pay attention to a great many particulars, he's saying you need the Begriff mind. You need evidence. You need to see what's in nature and organize your mind according to that. If you don't do that, if instead you just sit back and think about what you think the world is like, and you lay out your schemas and your plans like Parmenides did, he says that's terrible. That's a betrayal of the potential of the human mind. The human mind needs to be focused on leashing itself to what's real, not just making arbitrary conjectures. He's got other quotes elsewhere I don't have time for that I'm not going to go into about learning. Oh, maybe I do have one of them here. Let's see if I've got this one. Yeah, he says learning doesn't teach wisdom. Oh, there it is. Much learning does not teach understanding. Much learning does not teach understanding. So it's saying you can learn a tremendous amount and still be disconnected from the world. You can go to universities and seminars and you can consult with thinkers from all over the world. And if they're all noetic thinkers, you're going to end up being a noetic thinker too. It's not enough to just put a lot of stuff in your head. You have to do quality control. You have to focus on what's real, right? He's got another place elsewhere, which I don't have here, where he says, likewise, you shouldn't be seeking wisdom from people who have a reputation for wisdom, because all they know is what's reputed. They know the things that give them a great reputation because they value their reputation. And so he says, even the Greeks with the greatest understanding for insight, like Homer, he says, they should be flogged and thrown out of the curriculum. He says, you should look at nature, right? You should not let other people tell you what's true. You should directly interact with the world to find out what's true. Over and over, in different way after different way, in different formulation after different formulation, he says the same thing over and over. He's got a place where he says, eyes are more accurate witnesses than ears. Now, this is an era where most opinions weren't written down, they were told to you. Right? The Daily News, the crier would come and he would tell you what the news was from other parts of the world. Right? And what he's saying is, you shouldn't trust so much in gossip, in opinion. You should go out into the world and look for yourself. Now, you might not see that just from a sentence like eyes are more accurate witnesses than ears. He might be saying that he trusts vision more than hearing. Certainly seems like it at first. But it's when you put it alongside the other aphorisms that you can see what he means. It's the only way to reconcile them so that it's one coherent, that one person could have said both things. So you with me so far? Shall I go into? Oh, go ahead, Joseph.
So just basically, it's the idea of how you get to a truth,
yeah,
right? And then just the underpinning logic that how do you determine what is objectively, real?
That's right.
And there's a lot of logic that goes underneath this that supports all of this, like what our impressions are, what are another understandings of like catalytic impressions and all that kind of thing as well.
That's right.
So there's an underpinning logic to all of this, in addition to, the reason why our experiences are what are lead to wisdom versus what we're just getting sort of secondhand knowledge.
Yeah, he's laying out a sacred nature-based epistemology for how we know things and what we should trust and what we shouldn't. Sharon, go ahead. You have your hand up.
I like that statement where he says, much learning does not create understanding. In the period of my life when I taught, you would have students who were absolutely brilliant, but they lacked what I call that integrative function.
Yes.
And so when it came to performing a practical task,
yes,
they were at the bottom of the barrel because the understanding was not there. So I'm wondering if any of the philosophers talk about the capacity of the mind to integrate. We talked about eyes and ears, but that integrative function, as I saw it as a teacher over the years, is something that was hard to define. But when you saw it, when you saw the lack of it, you instantly knew it.
Yes. Hegel writes about this a lot. When he talks about Begriff as being a power of the mind, not only to attach you to the real world experience and your own feelings, but also to form wholes, that it is a synthesizing, integrative function of the mind. And it's why people who live a very Begriff life feel at home in the world in a way that alienated Verstand people don't. And it's a way that Begriff people often have knowledge that involves praxis, doing, that they've integrated their understanding with their activities in the world. You get a lot of Begriff carpenters and stonemasons and potters, because to be good at those things requires you to pay a lot of attention to the materials you're working with and what they will or won't do, and to your own practices and whether you've aligned those practices with what the materials will or won't do. And that that's where you see the holism. But likewise, if you live a life, an academic life where you don't ever apply the ideas you have, you can create these whole complex systems of thought that are completely impractical and that you don't know how to apply to anything because you've alienated them from the practice and from the world and as a result you lose the capacity to form a whole with them. So yeah, it's something the Greeks allude to, but that Hegel is the first one to really clearly talk about the whole creating function. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I need to disagree with that to a certain degree, because we're not living in the age of the Greeks. The world is so much more complex. There's so much more information. apparently every 90 days or something, or 180 days, the information doubles. So one can't have knowledge of the world through direct experience everywhere.
Right.
So therefore, I do understand that secondary information, whether it's academic or through a book or whatever, that's important. The compromise I make in this sense is I feel like I know a lot of things about a lot of things, but I'm never an expert at hardly anything. But one needs to be, however, a practicing expert in some area.
Yes.
Because then you have an understanding that how being connected is to the reality of the world as it is.
Yes.
But if you don't have that connection, then everything becomes secondary, somebody else's opinion, whatever it is. So I think you have to have both, but you can't be an expert in 5,000 things. You just have to accept somebody's understanding to a degree, right? And so to appreciate how deep it could be if only you were in that position. But therefore, the modern world with so much information forces you to, in a sense, in a way, I hate to say it that way, to specialize at least to a degree.
Yes.
And what you do remain is somehow broad in other ways, but you know you never have the depth in all these other areas.
Yes.
But you have to have it in one area.
Yeah.
Because
I'm not sure
the area that grounds you.
Yeah. I'm not sure what Rick said, or what you're disagreeing with is necessarily like what Rick said, though, I guess. Yeah.
I think you agree, but you think you disagree.
Okay.
Because Heraclitus also says, seekers after gold dig up much earth and find little. And he says, men who love wisdom should acquaint themselves with a great many particulars. And so he's saying you should learn all that you can, for sure. And you should go out into the world and, get your hands dirty and do what you can. But the thing is to distinguish that from understanding, to understand that it's a kind of understanding that's different from the understanding that you have about the thing that you're deep into the world with. So in your case, it's art, maybe, and you know art to a depth that there are other things that you know, but you don't know at that depth. And that those two kinds of understanding are different kinds of understanding, is what he's saying.
Yeah.
That it's very easy for the human brain to conflate them with each other and think that because I've read about a thing that I know it with the same confidence that I know the thing that's actually my area of expertise. You see this with doctors in a hospital, in a medical environment, a lot, where it's so amazing to actually go through the process and become a doctor and become expert at something. Some doctors come out of that with humility and say, wow, there's so much to know about the world. Yeah. And other doctors come out of it with arrogance and say, if I'm great at this, I'm great at everything. Let me now tell you how to run your life. Let me tell this nurse what she should do.
Rick, that's exactly what I was thinking as I was listening. I was thinking about doctors because I have recently seen this ENT, and when I ask certain questions about something that's related to my issue that I'm having, he'll say, "Oh, that's something else," or he kind of dismisses. He's also a friend of my brother-in-law, who's also an MD, and I mentioned that to my brother-in-law. This ENT, he is the absolute expert in this, ear, nose, throat, blah blah blah, but he doesn't seem to, because I'll ask him a question about something that is kind of psychological, mental issue, that because I'm having this issue, so it gives me this anxiety or whatever. And does he think about, does he kind of want to see other parts of me, total me, and not just, this ear, nose, throat issue? So there's something to be said about, and I think my brother-in-law is more of a person who's more rounded kind of a doctor. His specialty is anesthesia, but he's also very sensitive and has an ear for other, psychological, mental kind of issue that's related to that one specific physical ailment that you're having or something.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It's points well taken. Richard and then Sharon.
I'll let Sharon go first since you're talking about doctors. Yeah.
Okay,
Well, I
Sharon,
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to say, I wanted to follow up on something that Phil said.
Yeah.
There's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of information in the world, Phil, I think, but it's not necessarily knowledge, right?
Yes.
And I want to build on what you said about expertise. You
Yes.
develop expertise when you get knowledge in a specific area. And in developing that expertise, that's where the integrative function is maximized.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're not functional. And I'm an anesthesiologist too, and I can tell you, you have to know a lot about what you're doing.
Yes.
Now, the rest of information that you get, your curiosity is the only limit. That's why I'm standing here and I'm listening today at all the philosophical interpretations of things that I observed to be real over my career. And it's fascinating for me to listen how you interpret the mind, the consciousness. I mean, I've hypnotized many patients and I've seen when you take the mind away, what nature brings out.
Right.
And that's part, particularly when you can't cope with something like severe anxiety, right? And you help them to put the pieces in place to have a functional life. But it's all a spectrum.
It is.
A big spectrum.
And
we never ever really create a whole. It's a continuous journey towards that whole.
Right. The whole that we are at any instant has always just transformed from some previous generation of itself, and it's also in the process of transforming into the next generation of itself.
Correct.
It's not internally coherent and consistent, only in places, and in other places there are contradictions, and the working out of those contradictions is the unfolding of the new generation of order that we're becoming.
That's right.
And that a lot of it's happening under our consciousness, and we often don't see until afterwards how we've changed, and we look back and go, wow. It's like reading an old journal entry and you realize you don't agree at all with what you wrote, but you did at the time, and you're like, I've become another person.
Well, the concept of living life forward and understanding it backward is a magnificent expression, because that is how it actually is.
It is.
And sometimes life presents you,
Sharon.
And sometimes life presents you with the same situation to see what you've learned.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
Are you going to use your emotion? Or are you going to go into your experience bank and say, well, this didn't turn out this way the last time. Let me try something different. That's the judgment. That's the experience. That's the integration of your being.
Yes.
Sharon, could you repeat that again? That was so well said. Did you say live forward, but look back?
But understand backwards.
Backward.
This is Kierkegaard.
Is that right?
He says that one of the great difficulties or tragedies of life is that life has to be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. Which, I mean, that's what a philosopher lives for, is the moment when you can sum up something so important and potent in such a few words that are so memorable. Right? That's the aphorism. He's like, for a moment, he's almost Heraclitus there, or Thales.
Yes.
He's come up with a beautiful condensation. It's poetry when you can do that.
I also interpret like Hannah Arendt and saying something similar, in that the past is a driving force. Yeah,
she does.
Speaking of which, David, hopefully we can continue that Hannah Arendt session sometime. But I know you're into a lot of things. But okay. Anyway,
I am reading that Hannah Arendt book, by the way, The Human Condition.
I love it.
Cool.
I'm reading it. I'm going through it.
Yes. Good. So, Richard, you had your hand up.
Yes. Sort of my quick aside, although this is not what I wanted to discuss. Like in response to Ginny's maybe negative experience, or maybe someone else's, they negative experience with a doctor. But the doctors is one of those professions, in particular surgeons, where they're shown to have a high proportion of psychopaths. But anyway,
I have to respond to that.
Surgery specifically.
I must respond to that.
Yes, please do.
I have spent my entire life. I'm an anesthesiologist living with surgeons of varying specialties.
Right.
And in defense of them, they're not psychopaths. If you look at the training, what they are truncated adolescents. They have that, right?
Say it again.
Truncated adolescence.
That's right.
Truncated adolescence.
Right. Because what happens is the pressure of learning and dealing with really very, very, very big issues, sometimes before you yourself are emotionally ready.
Right.
To integrate and act accordingly. So you become a physician, and then the culture gives you a godlike status.
Right.
And you have to live up to your cultural expectation. And what comes out of that mismatch sometimes, and I'm listening to Jenny, is not appropriate. Sometimes there's empathy is lacking, compassion is lacking,
right,
until you get much older. So you'll find you'll meet a physician in their 60s and 70s, and they're a much different person than they were in their 30s and 40s. Lots of arrogance.
Yes.
And just that's because the maturative process has been truncated. They're not psychopaths.
Well, okay. So okay. First of all,
that was going a little too far. But
no. Hear me out. Okay. I think that's a really good summing up of what truncated adolescence. That would very much epitomize Benedict Cumberbatch's performance of Doctor Strange. Anyway, and never mind. But psychopathy, it's a spectrum. Okay. But I guess, according to how they've kind of drawn the line, on the psychopathy test, it's about 1% of the population, but you might find it more more highly representative in surgeons, not just
2
surgeons,
or 3%,
politics, maybe closer, upwards, depending upwards towards, even 5, I don't know, but even journalists, police, law enforcement.
Still a minority.
Yeah, still a minority, Sir Sharon. So but I'm not trying to make a blanket statement, but okay. My bigger kind of response was to Phil, kind of the doubling of information every how many days it was, whatever. And the problem is it's we're not necessarily we're not even close to keeping up with understanding or knowledge. And knowledge is problematic in English, and this is less problematic in having studied French or and also knowing Chinese. So in French, the word to know, there's 2 different words.
Yes.
There's I'll put it in the
please
in the chat here.
I love collecting these terms. Let's see what the French have.
Or to know, actually.
Savoir, like taste.
Savoir.
And connaître.
Forget the question mark at the end. Okay.
Oui.
But so savoir is a kind of a factual. I know that the time is this, or I know that the train will arrive at this time, or whatever. But connaître. And then of course, being French, it's conjugated depending on whatever. But
oui.
That's someone, or this language, right?
Personal,
so
direct
acquaintance. That experience, and that's that integrative part of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so speaking of this information, this is kind of what we see, epitomizing our modern society polarization with technology and social media is really being the gasoline on this. It's not hard for us, for those of us in technology that's kind of been seeing this building, this big data has been sort of so in vogue for the last 5-10 years, but then it's a few years ago, a lot of businesses invested in all this, we don't know what to do with all this data. But those companies that are doing stuff with it, it's still like they're applying these machine learning algorithms, but they're still not really fundamentally an understanding. It's basically just analyzing this pattern. And it's like, oh, if we do our ranking algorithms and we do this, people spend more time on our platform, and then we can sell more ad revenue. And then the goal for businesses to make money, and to sell ads. And so it creates this feedback polarization loop, forcing people into these bubbles, right? So.
Thank you, Richard. Sharon, then Joseph, then Phil.
Well, talking about a play on the word Noah, an odd thought just crossed my mind, because if you read enough scriptural text, it says, and so knew each other. Knowing was to have sex, right?
Yes. Yes, English is problematic.
Yes, that is what it was. And I want to, again, go back to Phil, what he said about information and technology. One of the fascinating things about the profession I'm in is how we're utilizing AI, all the data from AI, right? And what we're using it for. And we're finding, yes, we now have more data than we ever had. We have population medicine. We know about the social determinants of healthcare. But then what do we do with it?
Right.
And it still comes down to us, the human being, looking at it, interpreting it, make a decision, and going to the other human being with the decision base, with the choices.
Right.
So the way medicine integrates AI in research, it's a boom. In fact, that's why we have the mRNA vaccine so very, very quickly. But when it comes to clinical practice, it's not baby steps. We're along the way, but the utilization is an interesting pathway.
Thank you, Sharon. Joseph, then Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of information is really interesting, and that yes, data will get us to a certain point where we can start, but we still have to be able to ask the questions. And the only reason we can ask the questions is through wisdom in our interactions with others. So data only allows us to understand like what is actually exactly in existence now, and it may provide us different information in the sense, or different insights into what we already know. But it won't necessarily allow us to really do the deep type of inquiry that we need in order to change things or to get better at anything. And that's where I see a lot of where these AI projects are really suffering, in particular where I work, is that they fail to really, they even have they fail to understand what wisdom is. They even know how to get to the point of knowledge, but they can't get to the point of wisdom. And I think that that's the interesting part, is that human component. Like they even have, analysis, synthesis, and then knowledge models that I've seen. But this idea of wise action, where they can actually come up with questions, that still seems to be problematic. And that's where the arts and things like that really come into play. Because they allow us to ask the questions and think, beyond the data itself. So I just wanted to add that, since we were talking about data.
Yeah, it's a good point. Phil, and then we're going to wrap up for today.
Yeah, it seems to me like there are three kind of tests for truth. One is correspondence, one is functionality, the other is coherence. It seems like part of the problem with information overload that we live in is that we reduce correspondence is understanding, and it isn't. It's just sort of like this and this can correspond. If we have enough correspondence, then, like you said, and money becomes an issue, then in a sense, obviously you have enough information to generate a kind of truth that will attract people. Functionality, I quite often argue with people about the flatness of Earth. And I said, of course, I'm smart enough to understand that the world is not flat. But functionally, I operate as if the world is flat.
We all do, right?
For all practical purposes, it's true, okay?
Yes.
The problem is that we do not have enough understanding of the type that has to do with coherence, right?
Right.
That somehow integrates this into the whole thing that incorporates a broader understanding that, if not wisdom, at least approaches wisdom. Because and the model of education, and once I go back to that, is that we are producing people who are followers, who are utilitarian, productive individual to expand the economic structure of the money system. Instead of producing people who can think, at least to the degree they can think. And I'm not saying everybody is able of being wise people, but they certainly could be wiser than they are. And we don't have a way of teaching people that they have to get to the next step, which is coherence. How do you create an understanding system that incorporates a lot of diversity and differences and all of that together to produce a kind of model that you could say, oh, okay, now I have a better than just information or data, right?
May I please answer that?
Sure.
I want to talk about to Richard's point, because the medical profession does see these inadequacies that we talked about. And there was a pilot program that started at Albert Einstein School of Medicine in New York, where you would go to medical school free if you did 2 years of humanities before medical school.
That's
and so change. That is the change.
Yeah.
And when I was on the admissions committee, we constantly discussed the need to change the curriculum to provide our young minds with an integrative function.
Yeah.
But let's see how many other medical schools around the country copy that model that just started in New York, probably about 4 years ago. You have to do 2 years of humanities. You get to go to medical school for free. Now, it extends your training by 2 years, but it should make you a more empathic and compassionate and sympathetic physician.
Yes.
Because you now have a broader information base, a knowledge base on which to make a decision.
What a wonderful idea. Yeah.
I agree. And on that note, I'm going to ask you all for your opinion. So we got through what I had planned for Heraclitean epistemology, which was essential to understanding Hegel's model of the mind. But we haven't yet touched on the quotes that talk about the dialectic, where Hegel got the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that all of this is built out of. So it's up to you guys. For next week, should we finish this by talking about Heraclitus's dialectic?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
I have no opinion. It's all new.
No, yeah, definitely. That's the most interesting part.
It's not going to be coherent unless we have a total structure rather than just half of it.
I might have to take off work for that.
Okay, so then it sounds like that's unanimous. So we'll finish Heraclitus next week by talking through the dialectic and showing how that's what's in Hegel and Marx and Smith, and then that'll set us up after that to pick up and resume the essays. Now we'll have the epistemology and the dialectic in our heads. We'll be able to see what Smith is saying more clearly.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
We'll
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick. I mean,
thank you, David.
Thank you, Rick. Very good. Bye, David.
I don't know why David doesn't say anything the entire time when he's the organizer.
David is the genius behind the scenes.
Yeah.
It was like once in a few months, and you probably missed it. Maybe you weren't here.
It was like
last week. If you thought it was every 2 weeks, then
we all said, "Oh my God, David said something."
Well, maybe he's the invisible.
And he's not saying anything just to make us look silly.
Well, he's read all of the Kenneth Smith and he's thought about it, and he's just glad to see people talking about it and getting exposed to it.
Well, thank you, David.
I already know what I think. I'd rather hear what Rick says.
Are we up to it, David?
So far, so good.
Good, great.
But you can tell us what to think, and we'll be okay. I mean.
So next week, Heraclitus' dialectic. I'll write up the intro now and send it off to David so we can get it posted today.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next week.
Bye.
Next week.
Bye.